Across continents, outlaw motorcycle clubs have redefined the meaning of dominance. From the highways of America to the streets of Moscow, their power reaches far beyond the open road. And at the very top of that world stands the Hells Angels. These are the 15 most dangerous Hells Angels in history. Maurice "Mom" Boucher. Maurice "Mom" Boucher was born on June 21, 1953, in a small town in Quebec, Canada. Life was hard from the beginning. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade. With no job, no money, and no direction, he turned to a life of crime. He started using drugs, and for survival, he turned to robbery and stealing. Eventually, he was caught and sent to prison in the early 1980s for armed robbery. Most people come out of prison hoping for a fresh start, but not Maurice. He used that time to make dangerous friends. He joined a white supremacist biker gang called the SS, which had strong ties to the famous motorcycle club, the Hells Angels. Therefore, when he was released in 1986, he didn't slow down. Just months after serving time for assaulting a teenager, he joined the Hells Angels Montreal chapter in 1987. He was smart, driven, and ruthless. That's how he quickly rose to lead their most feared group, the Nomads, an elite division within the club. But power wasn't enough. He wanted dominance. And then everything changed in 1994, when the Hells Angels clashed with a rival gang called the Rock Machine. The Hells Angels wanted to dominate Quebec's lucrative drug trade. The Rock Machine refused to back down, challenging their grip on the territory. So the Quebec biker war broke out. What started as a turf fight over drug profits turned into a full-blown war. For the next 8 years, Quebec became a battlefield. Bombings shook neighborhoods. Cars and buildings were set on fire. Innocent people got caught in the crossfire, and more than 160 people were killed. But in January 1995, Boucher decided to start a new Hells Angels chapter, which he would lead. The Hells Angels Nomads chapter was a group including the most powerful Hells Angels in Quebec, not bound by geographical locations like other Hells Angels chapters. Just 2 years later, something happened that changed Boucher's vision altogether. In March 1997, a hitman who worked for the rival Rock Machine gang became a police informant. That means he told police everything he knew in exchange for a lighter punishment. This made Maurice Boucher very angry. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Since 1985, 3 different killers connected to biker gangs had made deals with the police and received less prison time. Boucher believed that if gang members continued to make deals like this, the Hells Angels could lose power. So, he came up with a plan. He wanted to do something so shocking and scary that the justice system would never be able to offer deals again. His idea? Kill people who worked for the justice system. And he started at the bottom, with the prison guards. On June 26, 1997, 2 members of the Hells Angels carried out the plan. They shot and killed Diane Levine, a prison guard, while she was driving home from work. But this did not end here. On September 8, 1997, things worsened. 2 of the Hells Angels members waited outside the Rivière des Prairies prison. When 2 prison guards, Pierre Rondeau and Robert Corriveau, were leaving a prison, they opened fire. Pierre Rondeau was killed, and Robert Corriveau was severely hurt, but he survived. Shortly after, Boucher was arrested and went to trial in 1998. The jury was scared, and he was declared innocent and walked free. The whole country was stunned. But the justice system didn't give up. In 2002, they tried again, and this time, he was found guilty of ordering the murders and sentenced to life in prison. The prison didn't stop him either. In 2015, police uncovered evidence that Boucher had ordered a mafia hit from inside his prison cell. Even behind bars, his influence stretched beyond the walls. But in 2022, something happened that none of his enemies could do. Maurice Boucher died in prison due to cancer at the age of 69 on July 10, 2022. But even a man like Boucher didn't rise alone. Standing beside him from the very beginning was his right-hand man, his closest ally, the man who handled the dirty work in silence. Normand Biff Hamel. In the streets of Montreal, they called him Biff. Born into a working-class family, Normand Hamel wasn't looking for rules. He was looking for respect. He started dealing drugs in the 1970s, and by the time police caught him in 1978, he was already deep in the game. In 1981, he joined a violent biker gang called the SS, known for attacking outsiders. That's where he met a man who would become his best friend, Maurice "Mom" Boucher. Together, they were unstoppable. By 1985, Biff had joined the Hells Angels. That same year, he came face to face with death during the Lennoxville massacre, when 5 Hells Angels were killed by their own. Biff was held at gunpoint and given a choice: go inside and die, or switch sides and live. He chose to live and became more powerful than ever. Biff helped carry out revenge hits, handled drug deals, and even gave out kill orders. He managed gang territories and helped other bikers earn their way back into the club, if they were willing to kill for it. In 1986, he became a full-patch member of the Hells Angels. Later that year, he helped his best friend, Boucher, join the gang too. When the leader of a rival gang, the Death Riders, was murdered in 1987, Biff helped bring what was left of their crew into the Hells Angels. He was responsible for supervising the recruits. But Biff didn't just play tough in the streets. He played smart in business. He ran a coffee import company as a front. Millions of dollars were later found hidden in the owner's home. In 1988, when Boucher was arrested for hijacking a truck, Biff was the one who showed up with $10,000 in cash to bail him out. By the mid-90s, Biff was one of the most powerful bikers in Quebec. He was rich, connected to the Italian mafia, and controlled bars and drug operations across Montreal, Sorel, the Laurentians, and even into Ottawa. In 1995, he helped launch the Nomads, the Hells Angels' most elite chapter. Biff was a founding member. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, he was feared. But in 2000, the war caught up to him. On April 17th, while taking his son to the doctor in Laval, Biff was ambushed by gunmen from the Rock Machine. He was unarmed. He tried to run. 2 bullets in the back, and just like that, the right hand of Boucher was gone. Hamel was old school, a street enforcer raised in the chaos of Quebec. But the next man wore a suit by day and leather by night. Paul Eichscheid. He wore a suit by day and leather by night. To the outside world, Paul Eichscheid appeared to be a normal person, a stockbroker working at Charles Schwab, the kind of man who discussed money, not murder. But behind the clean smile was something darker. By the early 2000s, Paul had joined the Hells Angels in Mesa, Arizona. Every week, the gang held secret meetings called church at their clubhouse. It looked like a bar, but inside, behind closed doors, they planned drug deals, weapons sales, and worse. On October 27, 2001, one of the bikers was told to find some girls. He came back with Cynthia Garcia, a 44-year-old mother of 6. At first, Cynthia joined in, laughing, drinking, and talking. But then, she made fun of the club. She said things they didn't like. She didn't know who she was talking to. Cynthia was beaten, kicked, and stomped while she lay on the clubhouse floor. Then, Paul and 2 others threw her into the trunk of a car and drove her deep into the Arizona desert. There, they stabbed her nearly 30 times. One of them even tried to cut off her head. Her body was found days later. On Halloween, the killers got away. However, in 2003, the truth began to emerge. A secret investigation, code-named Operation Black Biscuit, was monitoring everything. Undercover agents had joined the gang. Even one of their own, Michael Kramer, turned into a government informant. He had been there that night. He told the agents everything. The led to the arrest of Paul. Paul was brought to court. Due to his clean record, the judge let him wait at home with an ankle monitor. But Paul had other plans. He cut off the monitor, used a fake passport, and ran. For years, no one knew his whereabouts. Therefore, the U.S. Marshals added him to their top 15 most wanted list. Finally, in 2011, they found him in Buenos Aires, Argentina, living with a wife and child. He looked different, heavier, bald, with a long beard. He was arrested, but he didn't go quietly. He fought for years to stay in Argentina. Thousands of people even signed a petition in support of him. In the end, he lost. Paul Eichscheid was sent back to the U.S. in handcuffs to face the charges he had run from. But the next man didn't hide behind a clean image. Adam Lee Hall. Not every Hell's Angel made their name through gang wars or escape stories. Some, like Adam Lee Hall, became feared for something else, brutal violence, even against their own. By 2011, Hall was a high-ranking Hell's Angel in Massachusetts. He believed another member, David Glasser, had stolen from him. However, instead of resolving the issue within the club, Hall chose violence. He grabbed a baseball bat and beat Glasser so severely that it sent a message, "Don't cross me." Therefore, Glasser went to the police, and that made him a target. Soon after, Glasser disappeared. So did two of his friends, Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell, men who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. For 11 days, police searched. Then they made a horrifying discovery. 3 bodies, buried and wrapped in plastic bags. They had been tortured, cut apart, and shot. Glasser was the one they wanted, but his friends were killed just for being there. Even after he was arrested, Hall showed no regret. From jail, knowing his phone calls were recorded, he threatened Glasser's girlfriend and her family, trying to scare them into silence. But the law didn't back down. At trial, Hall and 3 others were found guilty. They were all sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Adam Lee Hall didn't just break the rules, he proved that in the world of the Hells Angels, betrayal, even if it's just suspected, is answered with death. Hall showed how far violence could go, but what came next was even more dangerous betrayal from within. George Weathern. Before George Weathern ever rode a Harley or broke the Brotherhood, he was just a kid from Oakland, California. His dad was a bartender. His mom worked as a telephone operator. By 16, George had already dropped out of school. His girlfriend was pregnant, and he was under considerable pressure. His mom told him to leave her, and he did. The unfortunate baby was given up for adoption, so George ran straight into the military. He joined the U.S. Air Force, hoping to start over. But trouble followed him. He broke rules, got in fights, and by 1958, he was kicked out with a dishonorable discharge. When he came back to Oakland, he didn't look for a quiet life, but for chaos. He joined the Hells Angels, led by Sonny Barger, in the chapter known as the Mother Chapter, the most feared club in the country at the time. He climbed high, becoming the vice president of the Oakland chapter. His job, running drugs and selling angel dust and LSD, especially to hippies across California. George had power, money, and respect, but his world was built on danger. In 1979, during a drug-fueled fight, George shot another Hells Angel named Buttons Mitten, but he played it smart. In the court, he portrayed it as self-defense and walked free. But his most significant move came later. In 1984, George was arrested again for drugs. This time, instead of staying loyal to the club, he made a choice that shocked everyone. He became an informant for the FBI. He told them everything, names, crimes, and how the club worked from the inside. Because of his words, the top Hells Angels went to prison, so George and his family had to vanish. They were placed in the Witness Protection Program, cut off from the world he once ruled. Years later, he wrote a book called A Wayward Angel, telling the world what went on inside the club. George Weathern didn't just break the rules, he broke the code. And once you do that in the Hells Angels, you're done. Current whereabouts of George Weathern are still unknown. While some betray the club with words, others do it after leaving a trail of bodies behind. Yves Apache, Trudeau. People called him Apache. Some called him the Mad Bomber. But everyone in Quebec's underworld knew one thing. When someone needed to be taken out, Trudeau got the call. He was born in 1946 and grew up in Montreal. In 1968, he joined the Popeyes Motorcycle Club, which would later become part of the Hells Angels. At first, he was just another tough guy in the gang. But Trudeau had an exceptional talent for killing. He rose fast by doing the club's dirty work, taking out rivals and enemies one by one. By the 1970s, Quebec's biker world was at war. Trudeau became Popeye's top hitman during bloody fights with rival gangs like Satan's Choice and Devil's Disciples. Therefore, when the Hells Angels took over the Popeyes in the late 70s, they kept Trudeau and gave him more power. He used bombs, bullets, and ambushes. His hits were quick, violent, and final. In 1985, Trudeau's darkest moment arrived. The Lennoxville Massacre. 5 members of the Hells Angels North chapter were seen as weak and out of control. Trudeau helped set them up and kill them, one by one. He didn't hesitate. But even the deadliest man in the gang has limits. Later that year, Trudeau was arrested. But in the meantime, the club had turned against him. They had taken his money and his bike into their custody. So he flipped. Trudeau became a police informant, telling everything about the murders, the structure, and the secrets. In 1986, he pleaded guilty to 43 counts of manslaughter. In exchange, he got a life sentence with a chance for parole after just 7 years. The public was furious. Families of the victims were heartbroken. But the deal stood. In 1994, Trudeau was released and given a new name, Denis Cote. He moved to a small town, worked as a bus driver, and tried to stay hidden, but the past doesn't forget. In 2004, he was arrested again, this time for assaulting a 13-year-old boy. He received an additional 4 years in prison. The judge said, "You've killed more people than Canada did in the Gulf War." Now hated by the Hells Angels in society, Trudeau lived in prison under heavy protection. In 2006, he got sick with bone marrow cancer, and in 2008, he died in a hospital bed, under guard, alone. Trudeau was the face of betrayal, the angel who flipped, and the monster who knew no loyalty to the club or anyone else. Just when it seemed the chaos couldn't spread further, it crossed borders, landing hard in the streets of Berlin. Kadir Padir. The Hells Angels didn't just make headlines in America or Canada. In Germany, one name stood out in the shadows of Berlin's underworld, Kadir Padir. Padir led the Berlin chapter of the Hells Angels. He was a commander, known for handling problems swiftly and decisively. His rule was simple: if you cross the club, you pay for it. In January 2014, someone did just that. A 26-year-old bouncer had stabbed a Hells Angels associate in a fight months earlier. Padir didn't forget, and he didn't forgive. Therefore, he planned one of Germany's boldest biker hits. In the middle of the day, at a busy Berlin betting shop, 13 masked Hells Angels stormed in. Cameras caught everything. 8 shots were fired. 6 hit the target. The man died on the spot. The message was loud and clear: no one touches the club and walks away. However, the widespread violence in broad daylight came with a cost. Police acted quickly. They watched the footage. They followed leads. They built their case. At the center of it all was Padir, the man who gave the order. He was arrested and charged with planning the murder. Therefore, Padir and 6 others were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The killings shocked Germany. The court's ruling sent a message back: even the highest-ranking gang leaders can fall. But by then, the world had seen how far the Hells Angels' reach went and how far they were willing to go to defend it. From Berlin to the South Pacific, the Hells Angels' trail of violence has left scars on every continent. In New Zealand, one name stands out for a particularly disturbing legacy: Zane Paura Wallace. A member of the Hells Angels New Zealand chapter, Wallace wasn't just feared in the streets. He brought the gang's violent code home with devastating consequences. Wallace had a long history of assaults, including against former partners. But in 2019, his violence escalated to murder. His victim, 30-year-old Jasmine Wilson, a mother of two. For months, Wallace subjected her to a reign of terror, beatings, intimidation, and psychological control. In one of the final incidents, he forced Jasmine's car off the road, snatched her keys, and brutally assaulted her, kicking her in the chest and slamming her head into a wall with such force that she lost consciousness. 2 days later, she was taken off life support. Even in custody, Wallace showed no remorse. On recorded prison calls, he issued threats toward Jasmine's grieving family, continuing his campaign of control and intimidation from behind bars. Police described Jasmine's injuries as among the worst they had ever seen. And the case didn't end with Wallace. His parents and sister were also convicted, found guilty of trying to cover up the crime and obstruct justice, highlighting just how far his influence reached. In the end, Zane Paura Wallace was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 15 years and 6 months. His case remains one of the most horrifying examples of Hells Angels violence, not on the battlefield of gang wars, but in the hidden world of domestic abuse, where the scars are no less real. Just when the dust seemed to settle in Europe, the storm moved again, this time to the far edge of the map, where a new kind of enforcer was waiting in New Zealand. Sonny Barger. Before the Hells Angels became the most feared motorcycle club in the world, there was Sonny Barger. He was born on October 8, 1938, in Modesto, California, but grew up in Oakland. His mom left when he was just 4 months old. He and his sister were raised by their grandma and their father, who worked the docks and drank too much. As a kid, Sonny got into fights, got suspended from school, and by 10th grade, he dropped out completely. But even then, he was looking for something bigger. At just 16 years old, Sonny faked his age and joined the U.S. Army. He liked the training, the weapons, and the brotherhood. But once the truth came out, he was kicked out after only 14 months. Back home in Oakland, he worked odd jobs and started riding motorcycles. In 1956, he helped form his first bike club, the Oakland Panthers. When that group broke up, Sonny and his friends created something new. On April 1, 1957, they formed the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels, using old patches from a defunct chapter in North Sacramento. Sonny became the president. From that day forward, the Hells Angels changed forever. Sonny's chapter became the most powerful in the world, known as the Mother Chapter. They weren't just bikers anymore. They were a brand, a gang, a force. By the 1960s, Sonny was a national name. The Hells Angels showed up in newspapers, on TV, and even at music festivals. They were asked to provide security for the Rolling Stones at Altamont in 1969, a concert that ended in chaos after a man was stabbed and killed by a member during the show. But even with fame, trouble followed Sonny everywhere. He was arrested many times, first for marijuana possession in 1963 and again in 1964. Then came charges for assault with a deadly weapon in 1965 and 1966. In the years that followed, he faced even more serious charges, including gun and explosives violations tied to his role in the gang. In one fight at a bar, he shot a man in the head, then claimed the gun fired by accident. But in his own book, he wrote, "Since the guy was already shot, I bent him over the pool table and shot him again." Sonny got convicted of attempted murder. In 1970, police caught a man delivering a suitcase to Sonny's house. Inside was $350,000 worth of heroin and cocaine. Sonny was arrested, but the charges didn't stick. Still, he spent 90 days in jail for leaving court without permission. But Sonny always came back stronger. He became the voice of the club, defending it in interviews, writing books, and calling the Hells Angels a group of hard-working patriots. He said they were against communism and for freedom. When college students protested the Vietnam War, Sonny and his bikers attacked the marchers in Oakland. They later told reporters they did it to protect America. Sonny once wrote to President Lyndon B. Johnson, offering to send Hells Angels to fight in Vietnam. The president never replied. In the 1980s and 90s, Sonny faced more charges, including conspiracy to blow up rival clubs and running illegal businesses. He served prison time, but never stepped down as a leader. In later years, Sonny moved to Arizona, beat throat cancer, and stayed involved with the club. He even testified at a Bandidos trial in 2018, denying that the Hells Angels and Bandidos were enemies. His 81st birthday party in 2019 was a major event at the Oakland clubhouse. In biker code, the numbers 8 and 1 stand for H&A, Hells Angels. Sonny Barger died on June 29, 2022, at age 83 after battling liver cancer. But to the Hells Angels and to outlaw motorcycle history, he wasn't just a rider. He was the king who built the empire. While others made their names in blood, one man built the name itself, shaping the club from legend to empire. Jonathan Nelson. In the world of the Hells Angels, power isn't always about riding the fastest bike. Sometimes it's about pulling the strings behind the scenes. Jonathan Nelson was the president of the Fresno chapter of the Hells Angels. People called him calm, focused, and dangerous. In 2014, Nelson believed a man named Joel Silva, a fellow Hells Angel, had become a problem. So he made a plan. Silva was invited to the Sonoma clubhouse, a place he thought was safe, but it was a trap. There, in a back room, Silva was killed, shot and disposed of without mercy. The order had come from the top, and at the top sat Nelson. Therefore, when police investigated, they found a plan built on precision. Every step had been planned. Every person had a role. Nelson wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, but he was the one who gave the green light. In court, the evidence was clear. Nelson had orchestrated the murder. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. It was a rare moment, a powerful Hells Angels leader finally facing justice. Jonathan Nelson's downfall proved something bigger. Even inside the Hells Angels, where loyalty is everything, betrayal, or even suspicion, can be a death sentence. Power gave the order, but betrayal came from inside the room. Russell Taylor Ott. In the outlaw world, betrayal usually comes from the outside, but sometimes it comes from someone who calls you brother. Russell Taylor Ott was the president of the Sonoma chapter of the Hells Angels, the same chapter Joel Silva belonged to. They rode together. They shared club secrets. But when Silva was marked for death, Ott didn't warn him. He helped set the trap. If Jonathan Nelson was the man who gave the order, Ott was the man who made sure it happened. He welcomed Silva into the Sonoma clubhouse, a place meant to feel safe. But Silva never walked out. He was murdered, right there, among men he trusted. Ott's betrayal cut deep. It showed that in the Hells Angels, no bond is unbreakable, not even between brothers in the same chapter. Therefore, when the truth came out, the fallout was massive. Russell Taylor Ott was charged, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, just like Nelson. While Taylor played his part, the next one ran the show. Nikati Arabach. Most Hells Angels made their name with fights and guns, but Nikati used strategy, connections, and fear. His grip was so strong that even the law stepped back. Victims stayed quiet, witnesses vanished. He started in Germany's red light districts. Nikati was born in Cologne, Germany, in 1972. By the early 2000s, he was already running a criminal empire in Germany's red light districts. He controlled bouncers, nightclubs, and brothels across multiple cities. To the outside world, it looked like a normal business, just part of the nightlife scene. But behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. A tightly controlled operation built on forced prostitution and human trafficking. In 2002, Nakati was arrested. He was charged with leading a criminal gang, along with multiple counts of pimping and trafficking. Just 2 years later, in 2004, he confessed to his crimes and was sentenced to 9 years in prison. But prison didn't stop him. Even behind bars, he was able to run his businesses. Not only that, but from the prison, he had planned to kill the lead prosecutor using a hired gun from Duisburg, Germany. But luck was on Nakati's side. A mistake in the court transcripts helped him avoid that charge. Eventually, he was deported to Turkey. After arriving in Turkey, Nakati began forming relationships with local biker groups. He began working closely with members of the Hells Angels. By the late 2000s, he had reportedly been patched in. In 2010, he became the president of the newly formed Hells Angels Nomads chapter in Izmir. After the arrest of a top European boss in 2013, he quietly moved up the ladder, becoming one of the most powerful Hells Angels in Europe. By 2015, Spain issued a warrant for his arrest. They accused him of drug trafficking, extortion, and illegal brothel operations. But Turkey doesn't extradite its citizens, so Nakati stayed free. Today, he lives in Monaco. Nakati built his power quietly. The next one pulled the trigger loudly. Brian Wayne Went. He came from out of state, but his role was just as deadly. Went was the president of the Salem chapter of the Hells Angels, based in Oregon, not California. He didn't know Joel Silva personally, but when the call came, Went didn't ask questions. He showed up. Joel Silva had been lured to the Sonoma clubhouse, thinking he was among friends. But behind closed doors, the plan was already in motion. And Went was the one chosen to pull the trigger. He delivered the fatal shot that ended Silva's life, then helped cover it up. Therefore, when police pieced together the evidence, they saw the full picture. This wasn't just a local hit. It was a cross-state conspiracy involving leaders from Fresno, Sonoma, and Salem, all working together to remove one man they saw as a problem. Went was arrested, charged with premeditated murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His case proved something chilling. The Hells Angels don't just operate in tight chapters. They move as one, united by a code, and willing to kill to protect it. Long before the club became a machine of violence, someone had to build the engine, and he started with a name that shook all of Canada. Michel Sky Langlois. Before the Hells Angels ruled Canada's biker world, a man named Michel Sky Langlois helped lay the foundation. Born in 1946 in rural Quebec, Langlois grew up working on a farm. He later moved to Montreal, earned a pilot's license, and picked up the nickname Sky because he flew his own plane. In 1964, he and a small group of bikers formed the Popeye Moto Club, which quickly grew into the most feared biker gang in Quebec. The Popeyes worked as hitmen and drug runners for major crime groups like the Dubois brothers and the Montreal Mafia. They became infamous for extreme violence, the kind that made even other outlaw bikers nervous. Therefore, when the Hells Angels expanded into Canada, they noticed the Popeyes. In 1977, the two groups merged, and Langlois became part of the first Hells Angels chapter in the country. By 1979, the Montreal chapter was split into two: north, led by Yves Le Boss Buteau, and south, led by Régent Zigzag Lessard. Langlois joined the north side, which was made up mostly of old Popeyes and known for its wild behavior and heavy drug use. In 1983, Buteau was murdered, and Langlois took over as the national president of the Hells Angels in Canada. While Lessard handled operations in Quebec, Langlois focused on growing the club into British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and even Vancouver and Halifax. Under his watch, the Hells Angels drove out the rival Outlaws and took over the drug trade in key cities. But that power came at a cost. In 1985, the club ordered the killing of 5 of its own members in what became known as the Lennoxville Massacre. While Langlois didn't lead the ambush, the fallout from the killings deeply damaged the club's reputation. It also caused a split in the biker world. Some riders refused to join the Hells Angels, including the Katzeta brothers, who went on to form the rival Rock Machine, setting the stage for the deadly Quebec biker war. Langlois stayed in the game. In 1998, one of his associates was caught with 178 kilograms of cocaine worth over $70 million at the US-Canada border. The drugs were meant for distribution in Montreal. Langlois was connected to the smuggling operation but avoided direct conviction. Then came Project Objection. In 2018, Langlois was arrested again. Undercover agents caught him running drug meetings in restaurants, claiming control over meth and hashish sales in Quebec. He was found to be moving hundreds of thousands of meth pills and multiple kilos of drugs. He pleaded guilty to drug trafficking, conspiracy, and gangsterism, and was sentenced to 58 months in prison. Langlois tried for parole in 2020, but was denied, partly because he was still meeting with known criminals in prison. After appealing, he was granted another hearing in 2021, but denied again. Finally, in July 2021, Langlois was released after serving 2/3 of his sentence. But there were rules: no wearing Hells Angels gear, and no contact with anyone involved in organized crime. Michel Sky Langlois wasn't just another biker. He was the man who helped bring the Hells Angels to Canada and stayed in the game for over 50 years. But every empire built on blood needs someone to clean house. No questions, no hesitation, just bodies left behind. Michel Jinx Genest. In the dark world of outlaw bikers, loyalty is everything, and breaking the code can be a death sentence. Michel Jinx Genest was a Hells Angel with blood on his hands. He played a key role in one of the gang's most notorious moments, the Lennoxville Massacre of 1985. It happened in a quiet town in Quebec's eastern townships. On the outside, it looked peaceful, but inside a heavily guarded Hells Angels bunker near Sherbrooke, 5 members of the Laval chapter walked into what they thought was a regular meeting. They never walked out. The Laval chapter had become known for chaos, too much partying, too many mistakes, and heavy drug use. The leadership had had enough. They called it a cleanup. Others called it a purge. Genest was one of the men who carried it out. The 5 Laval bikers were killed inside the bunker. Their bodies were stuffed into sleeping bags, weighed down with cinder blocks, and dumped in a nearby river. 2 other members of the chapter skipped the meeting that day. That decision saved their lives. This brutal hit became known as the Lennoxville Massacre, and instead of weakening the Hells Angels, it did the opposite. After the killings, the club became tighter, more ruthless, and more connected to powerful groups like the West End Gang and the Montreal Mafia. Genest's role didn't stop there. Just weeks later, on April 7, 1985, he murdered Claude Roy, another Laval member. Genest later admitted he killed Roy because he broke club rules, using hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, and possibly talking to the police. To Genest, it wasn't personal, it was business. And in the Hells Angels, breaking the rules meant breaking trust. Michel Jinx. Genest didn't just follow orders. He helped enforce the code, no matter how violent it had to be. Some followed orders. Others carved their own legend, 1 mile at a time, 1 deal at a time, until even the bosses took notice. David Wolfe Carroll. If Maurice Boucher was the general of Quebec's biker war, David Wolfe Carroll was his most loyal soldier. Born David MacDonald Carroll on April 1, 1952, in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, he was the son of a respected police officer, but chose a far different path. After a school incident involving explosives, Carroll dropped out and drifted into drug use and crime. His intelligence and unpredictability made him stand out in the local outlaw scene. He joined a gang called the 13th Tribe, where his violent streak and calculated nature caught the eye of none other than Maurice Boucher. Boucher saw potential and personally brought Carroll into the Hells Angels Montreal chapter. Once patched in, Carroll rose fast. He became Boucher's most trusted enforcer, earning the rare and ominous Filthy Few patch, a mark reserved for those who'd killed for the club. Behind the scenes, he oversaw drug trafficking operations across the Laurentians, played a key role in prostitution rings, and was known to settle scores personally. During the Quebec Biker War, Carroll developed a deep hatred for the rival rock machine. He was widely believed to have murdered several of their members, though nothing was ever proven in court. What made him truly dangerous was his ability to vanish. As police swept up Hells Angels across Canada, Carroll slipped through the cracks. For over 2 decades, he's been a ghost, wanted, hunted, but never found. To this day, David Wolf Carroll remains one of Canada's most elusive fugitives, a phantom from the deadliest chapter of biker history. But the Angels weren't alone in building an empire. South of the border, another force was rising, one no one expected to challenge them. That force would soon become their deadliest rival, the Bandidos. Here are the 15 most dangerous Bandidos in history. Number 15. Donald Chambers. Donald Eugene Chambers was a founding father of Bandidos, born on November 23, 1930. After serving in the United States Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, he returned to Texas and worked as a longshoreman. He had a passion for riding and had been a member of local clubs. Dissatisfied with the motorcycle clubs he joined, Chambers decided to form one of his own. On March 4, 1966, in San Leon, Texas, he founded the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. He named the club after Mexican bandits who lived by their own rules and chose red and gold as its colors, in honor of the Marine Corps. Recruitment began in biker bars across Houston and other nearby areas, and soon the Bandidos had over 100 members, many of whom were hardened Vietnam veterans. Not long after, Chambers was involved in a violent gunfight with a rival gang, with whom they had gathered to negotiate peace. Soon, the law enforcement was after him, and he had to relocate to New Mexico. By 1969, Chambers was on law enforcement's radar, but the darkest chapter of his life had yet to come. On December 22, 1972, Chambers and fellow Bandidos members abducted 2 drug dealer brothers. The brothers had tricked the Bandidos by selling them baking soda, claiming it was amphetamine. Seeking revenge, Chambers and his men drove them into the desert, forced them to dig their own graves, and then executed them. Their actions sent shockwaves even through the outlaw world. Chambers and his accomplices were convicted of the murders after testimony from a club prospect who had turned police informant. All 3 received life sentences. While Chambers was incarcerated, tragedy struck his family. In 1979, his 23-year-old son, Stephen Trammell Chambers, was shot dead during a nightclub dispute in Houston. The suspect fled, and decades later, in 2016, police arrested a man they thought was responsible, only to discover that the real killer had used a false identity. Chambers himself was paroled in 1983 after serving a decade behind bars. He stepped back from the Bandidos and eventually retired from the club altogether. He settled in El Paso, Texas, where he lived quietly until his death from cancer on July 18, 1999, at the age of 68. He was buried in Houston at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery under a gravestone marked with his name, the Bandidos insignia, and a phrase that summed up the outlaw life he embraced. "We are the people our parents warned us about." But when Donald Chambers was gone, the man who replaced him proved to be even more violent. Number 14. Ronnie Hodge. When Donald Chambers was behind the bars imprisoned, leadership of the Bandidos passed to Ronnie Hodge. He was ex-Marine who earned the nickname Mr. Prospect for patching into the club in just 1 month. Once elected national president, he styled himself Stepmother, a nod to Chambers' nickname Mother. Hodge was ruthless. He quickly reshaped the Bandidos by purging members he felt lacked true loyalty. Entire chapters in Montana and Indiana were shut down under his watch. Despite the cutbacks, the club thrived, replacing lost members with new recruits and expanding its reach. Then came 1978, and under Hodges' leadership, the Bandidos attended Bike Week in Daytona Beach for the first time. There, they struck a powerful alliance with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, Florida's dominant gang. Drugs became the backbone of this relationship. The Outlaws supplied cocaine, while the Bandidos supplied meth. This partnership helped elevate the Bandidos into the ranks of the Big Four outlaw motorcycle clubs. The Banshees conflict. By 1983, tensions with the Banshees Motorcycle Club erupted. A violent clash in Texas left one Bandido and the Banshees president dead. The Bandidos were enraged that a much smaller club would dare to take them on, especially in Texas. Not only that, but several Banshees had once been Bandidos, defecting in what's called a patchover. At the funeral of fallen member John Batchelor, national leaders gathered. They couldn't allow the insult to go unanswered. Hodge ordered intelligence gathering on the Banshees chapters in Dallas and Texarkana and levied a $100 assessment from each Bandido to fund retaliation. Different avenues of revenge were explored. Possible attacks included drive-by shootings and bombings. Eventually, leaders approved a bombing operation against two Banshees residences in Dallas. The 1983 bombings. To provide cover for the bombers, the Bandidos staged two large parties, one in Rapid City, South Dakota, and another in Corpus Christi, Texas. On the 4th of July weekend in 1983, most members attended, creating perfect alibis for those who carried out the attacks. The party in Corpus Christi was well advertised and billed as a 4th of July poker run to raise money for the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, with the goal of helping the crippled children of Nueces County. One of the national officers was sent to Houston to obtain the explosives for bombs. He stole what he needed from the back of a truck carrying demolition supplies. They planted two bombs, one under a van at a Banshee house, another against the foundation of a second home. The first device exploded, damaging property but injuring no one. Hours later, the second bomb detonated when a Banshee leader tried to drive his van with his infant daughter inside. Miraculously, neither was seriously hurt. The botched attacks drew federal attention. In 1985, the DIA, ATF, and FBI launched a major roundup of Bandidos nationwide. During this period, Randy Hansen, one of the bombers and a trusted enforcer for the Nomads, defected. Afraid for his life, he cooperated with the DEA. Hansen's information proved invaluable. While undercover agents had focused on the Northwest, Hansen provided an insider's view of the Bandidos' Texas heartland. He revealed details of the bombings, weapons stockpiles, and safe houses. In 1986, the ATF raided Little Joe Benavides' home, seizing machine guns, explosives, narcotics, and equipment linked to the bombing plot. By 1988, federal authorities indicted 23 members and associates. Most were arrested within months, while charges were dropped against 6 for lack of evidence. Others pled guilty. The remaining defendants stood trial that December. 7 were convicted, including Ronnie Hodge, who, along with several top officers, received 5-year sentences. Law enforcement declared the convictions a major victory, publicly claiming it marked the end of the Bandidos as a criminal organization. Number 13, Richard Marla.
I've been in the inner circle. I've been in the circle, man.
Among the most dangerous figures tied to the Bandidos Motorcycle Club is Richard Stephen Marla, a man whose violent legacy still echoes in Texas outlaw history. Marla joined the Bandidos in the early 2000s and quickly became known for his willingness to kill. In late 2001, Bandido Secretary Javier Negrete was gunned down outside Tiffany's Billiards in San Antonio. The club identified Robert Lara as the shooter, and retaliation followed. In 2002, Marla was awarded the notorious Expect No Mercy patch. It's only given to those who have committed violent acts for the club. Marla was unstoppable. In August 2004, during an argument, he fatally stabbed San Antonio boxing champion Robert Pekin Quiroga, the city's first world title holder. The killing shocked the community and drew national attention, forcing the Bandidos to publicly disown him, saying the killing was personal and not club business. Feeling abandoned and bitter, Marla later turned against the club while in prison. He testified in federal court about murders, drug trafficking, escort services, and other Bandidos operations. Testimony that prosecutors used to convict top leaders like John Xavier Portillo Defense lawyers argued he was acting out of spite and revenge for being expelled, but his insider knowledge made him a powerful witness against the organization. Despite his testimony against his brothers, Merla was convicted of the killings and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. His testimony later became crucial in a federal racketeering case against the Bandidos leadership, although defense attorneys claimed he was motivated by revenge after being expelled from the club. Richard Merla carried out his violence primarily on his own, but the men who came after him committed their crimes together, and what they did shocked an entire community. Number 12. Robert James Watson III. Robert Watson was the vice president of the Bandidos Bellingham, Washington chapter. Inside the club, he carried real influence, but outside, his name would forever be linked to the Cariaga family murders. When fellow Bandidos asked if he was involved, his stories never matched. Even his own chapter president condemned the crime, insisting women and children were off limits. Yet suspicion pointed straight back to Bobby, remembered as the man who dragged the Bandidos' name into one of Washington's darkest massacres. Number 11. Johnny James Watson. Johnny Watson, Bobby's younger brother, was not a Bandido, but he was just as dangerous when it came to violence. The patch didn't bind him, yet he joined his brother in carrying out the killings, proof that outlaw business can pull in even family members who live outside the club's rules. Number 10. Danny J. Kelly Jr. Kelly was a hang-around prospect for the Bandidos, with Bobby Watson sponsoring his membership. Once, he had been close to Johnny Cariaga, so close that he stood as best man at his wedding. But when Johnny accused him of theft, the friendship ended bitterly. That betrayal became the seed of murder, with Kelly choosing loyalty to the outlaw world over his former friend. The Cariaga family murders.
Kids up 911 reporting.
My whole family shot me too. We're shot right now, my family's dead.
The 911 call came from a 16-year-old boy in the Cariaga family, bleeding from gunshot wounds. He somehow found the strength to dial for help, but soon, the killer realized the boy had called 911 and then did the unthinkable.
When the killers heard him make that call, they put a pillow against his head. Then they set the Cariaga home on and disappeared into the night.
3 family members were shot dead, and their father, Johnny Cariaga, who owned a restaurant, was taken alive. Days later, his burned body was discovered in his truck, abandoned on a rural property. Investigators learned Johnny Cariaga wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was deeply tied to drug trafficking. He moved cocaine up from California, stashed tens of thousands in cash. He was taking supplies from Bandidos. But when his connections soured, the supplier turned against him. The motive was rooted in betrayal. The case stretched on for years, but in 2024, justice finally served. Bobby Watson, Johnny Watson, and Danny J. Kelly Jr. were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Cariaga murders showed how outlaw violence could wipe out a family, but in 1972, the Bandidos set their sights on a National Guard sergeant and marked him for death. Number 9. Jimmy R. Graves. Jimmy R. Graves, a member of the Bandidos Dallas chapter, became one of the earliest examples of just how far the club would go to protect its own. Jimmy's story is tied to the cold-blooded murder of a National Guard sergeant. It was a killing that shook Texas in the early 1970s. In March 1972, Charles Edwin Overfield, a 29-year-old father and National Guard sergeant, was preparing to testify against Robert Powell, a Bandidos associate. Powell had been charged with trying to burglarize a National Guard armory in Louisiana, hoping to steal weapons, and later attempting to bribe a witness. Overfield's testimony would have sealed Powell's fate and, in the process, exposed dangerous links between the Bandidos and organized crime. The club couldn't allow that. Overfield became a target. On March 9, 1972, as he traveled Interstate 20 near the Texas-Louisiana border, Overfield was ambushed. Gunfire tore through his vehicle, killing him instantly. It was a contract hit, carried out on orders meant to silence him forever. The message was clear. Testifying against the Bandidos could cost you your life. Jimmy always denied the allegation.
How long do you think the Bandidos motorcycle organization would last if we went out shooting?
Investigators quickly pieced together the chain of responsibility. A few months later, in July 1972, Graves pleaded guilty to the murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison. Jimmy R. Graves demonstrated that from the outset, the Bandidos were willing to go after law enforcement. But decades later, the club's power reached an even higher level under a man who became its most notorious president. Number 8. J. Jeffrey Fay Pike, better known as Jeff Pike, was born in Northern California in the late 1950s. He dropped out of high school and by the early 1970s had relocated to Texas. Pike worked ordinary jobs, dishwasher, cook, and home builder, but his life changed in 1979 when he joined the Bandidos motorcycle club. From the beginning, Pike stood out. He was ambitious and strategic, and he rose steadily through the ranks. By the mid-2000s, he reached the pinnacle of power, becoming national president of the Bandidos. Under his leadership, the club grew stronger, expanding its territory and deepening its involvement in criminal enterprises while competing against rivals like the Cossacks. But on May 17, 2015, under Pike's presidency, the biggest arrest of a biker gang happened in Waco, Texas. What began as a biker gathering turned into chaos when the Bandidos and rival Cossacks clashed in a crowded restaurant parking lot. By the end of the brawl, 9 bikers were dead, more than a dozen were wounded, and 177 arrests were made. Pike wasn't physically present, but prosecutors argued that the shootout reflected the violent culture he fostered at the top of the Bandidos hierarchy. The Waco massacre was only one chapter of Pike's criminal legacy. In 2016, federal authorities indicted him on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and drug trafficking.
Breaking developments in the federal case against a notorious motorcycle club leader. Jeffrey Pike just appeared in front of a judge on several charges, and we've learned he allegedly called for members to commit murder.
Among the most serious allegations was his role in the 2006 assassination of Anthony Benish, a man who had tried to start a Hells Angels chapter in Austin. Prosecutors portrayed Pike not as a distant figurehead, but as a man who approved and directed violence. In May 2018, after a lengthy federal trial in San Antonio, Pike was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and firearms charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. While Jeffrey Fay Pike was the national president, he did not run the empire alone. At his side was the national vice president, who was just as ruthless and often pulled the strings on the ground. Number 7. John Xavier Portillo. John Xavier Portillo rose through the Bandidos ranks to become national vice president, standing shoulder to shoulder with national president Jeffrey Fay Pike. Together, they ran the club at its most violent peak. He was the man who authorized violence, drug trafficking, and intimidation. One of the most infamous cases linked to him was the 2006 killing of Anthony Benish, who was shot outside a restaurant in Austin after attempting to start a Hells Angels chapter. Portillo's name also surfaced in connection with the 2002 death of Robert Lara, which came after Lara was accused of killing Bandidos secretary Javier Negrete. In May 2018, after a 3-month federal trial in San Antonio, Portillo was convicted alongside Pike on charges of racketeering, murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, assaults, and firearms violations. The courtroom evidence pulled back the curtain, exposing the Bandidos as a structured criminal enterprise where violence was as routine as business.
The verdict is now in. 2 top former Bandidos, National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and ex-Vice President John Xavier Portillo, found guilty in a 13-count indictment.
By September 2018, the sentence came down. 2 consecutive life terms plus 20 years in federal prison. He was also forced to forfeit firearms, a motorcycle, and cash seized from his home. For Portillo, once one of the most feared men in Texas outlaw circles, the empire was finished. As Portillo's reign came to an end in the courtroom, a new generation of Bandidos was already making headlines on the streets. Number 6. Chris Jake Carrizal. Christopher Jake Carrizal is one of the most recognizable figures in Bandidos history, remembered as the president of the Dallas chapter during the infamous Twin Peaks shootout in Waco, Texas. On May 17, 2015, tensions between the Bandidos and their rivals, the Cossacks, exploded outside a Twin Peaks restaurant. What began as a standoff escalated into an all-out gunfight in a crowded parking lot. By the time the smoke cleared, 9 bikers were dead, more than a dozen others were wounded, and 177 people were arrested. It remains the deadliest biker shootout in U.S. history. Carrizal quickly became the central figure of the case. As Dallas chapter president, he bore responsibility for leading his men into the bloodbath. On the trial, Carrizal admitted firing his gun but claimed it was in self-defense, testifying that a Cossack tried to attack him through his helmet. He also described watching his father, himself a Bandido, take a bullet to the shoulder during the melee. Despite the chaos and scale of the bloodshed, the trial against Carrizal ended in a mistrial, with jurors deadlocked. In the aftermath, all charges against the 177 bikers were dropped. The inability to secure convictions turned the Waco case into one of the most controversial failures in American criminal justice. For a while, Carrizal faded from headlines, but in May 2024, his name returned. Police say Carrizal and fellow Bandido Eric Grindstaff revved their motorcycles outside a Dallas man's home after midnight. When confronted, they allegedly kicked in the man's door, threatened to kill him, and Carrizal pointed a handgun through the glass. Both men, wearing Bandidos vests, were arrested and charged with aggravated assault and later released on bond. Carrizal's name will always be tied to the chaos of Waco, but not long before that, another Bandido president was making headlines of his own. Number 5. Howard Wayne Baker. Howard Wayne Baker served as the president of the Fort Worth chapter of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Under his leadership, the chapter operated less like a social club and more like a criminal crew capable of orchestrated violence. In December 2014, dozens of Bandidos stormed rivals the Ghost Riders, the Cossacks, and Wino's crew. Shockingly, Baker stood inside the lethal circle, directing the attack. Jeffrey Brady, a 41-year-old Ghost Rider, was dragged outside and executed in front of his wife and friends. 2 others were wounded before the Bandidos fled. At Baker's trial in 2017, prosecutors argued that he didn't need to pull the trigger himself. But under Texas's law of parties, evidence showed Baker stormed the bar, contained Brady, and orchestrated the chaos. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding him guilty of murder, aggravated assault, engaging in organized crime, and directing a street gang. In June 2017, Baker was sentenced to 45 years in prison for murder, with other charges merged or running concurrently. The message was clear. In Texas, leading a chapter also meant carrying the weight of its crimes. While Howard Wayne Baker showed how a Bandido president could orchestrate violence on a large scale, the next member revealed how even rank-and-file members carried the same code of intimidation. His story unfolded not in a bar or on the streets, but in the aisles of a grocery store, where a simple encounter turned into a deadly threat. Number 4. Albert De Leon. Albert De Leon, a 45-year-old Bandido from San Antonio, proved how far loyalty to the outlaw code can go. In May 2019, he pleaded guilty to retaliation after threatening a former Bandido who had turned government informant. It was the same man whose testimony had helped convict National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and Vice President John Xavier Portillo. The confrontation unfolded on February 22, 2019, inside an ordinary H-E-B grocery store in San Antonio. Then De Leon spotted the man he blamed for bringing down the Bandidos' leadership. He walked straight toward him, pulled a pistol from his waistband, cocked it, and delivered a chilling warning. "You're going to die today. You're a snitch. Jeff and John went down because of you." For a moment, the store froze. Although De Leon tucked the pistol away before walking off, the damage was done. It wasn't just a threat, it was a message to every potential informant that betrayal of the Bandidos came with consequences. In September 2019, Judge Fred Beery sentenced De Leon to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervision. Prosecutors were clear. His actions weren't just about personal anger. They were about enforcing the Bandidos' code of silence, ensuring loyalty through fear. That moment in a grocery store showed how far even ordinary members would go to defend the club's code of silence. But the next story is about someone very different, a man who came from reality television before stepping into the outlaw world. Number 3. Brandon Hance. Brandon Hance was once known as a contestant on the reality show Survivor, but his life took a darker turn when he joined the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Taking on the names Loco and Gun Drop, he quickly found himself entangled in violent clashes. In February 2023, prosecutors say Hance took part in a brutal assault on members of the Greybeards Motorcycle Club. He allegedly stood guard at the entrance of Bimba's bar, trapping Greybeards inside while fellow Bandidos carried out the beating. Their jackets were stolen. It was a calculated act of humiliation in biker culture. By December 2023, authorities claim Hance was involved in setting fire to the County Line Ice House, a Montgomery County bar that had hosted an event for rival club Brothers East. Witnesses, informants, and cell phone data tied him to the arson. Even though surveillance cameras failed to clearly identify the attackers, Hance's time with the Bandidos was brief. He was with the club for less than 2 years. His wife Erica testified in court that he quit the club in July 2024 after becoming disillusioned. The Bandidos placed a green light on him, effectively sanctioning other members to target him. Since then, Hance has spoken openly in interviews and on social media about his regret in ever joining the club. His lawyer told the court that his public criticism, combined with his exit, brought death threats against him and his family. Despite lacking a prior criminal record, federal prosecutors argue Hance played a role in organized violence. In February 2025, he was indicted on racketeering and arson charges, offenses carrying the possibility of decades behind bars. Brandon Hance showed how even brief members could cause chaos. But years earlier, the Bandidos' expansion overseas would ignite one of the bloodiest biker wars in history. Number 2. Anthony Spencer Snodgrass. Anthony Mark Spencer's life began in tragedy. Born into a broken home in Sydney, he never even knew if the name he carried was his actual birth name. His childhood was spent bouncing through various foster care placements. His father was absent, and his mother, who struggled with mental illness, ultimately took her own life. As a child in an Anglican boys' home, Spencer endured cruelty from other boys who once tried to drown him in a bathtub. Though he survived, the incident left him with a lifelong fear of water. Barely literate, Spencer poured his emotions into a diary filled with spelling mistakes, a private outlet for a boy who grew up lonely, rejected, and desperate for love. Drifting from one place to another, he finally found his place in the Comancheros Motorcycle Club. By the early 1980s, Australia's outlaw motorcycle scene was changing rapidly. The Comancheros Motorcycle Club had split into 2 factions: the city chapter, led by Anthony Snodgrass Spencer, and the Parramatta chapter, controlled by National President William Jock Ross. Ross had begun transforming the club into a paramilitary-style organization, but Spencer rejected the new direction. He wanted to live the biker life, not march like a soldier. In 1983, Spencer and his faction formally split from the Comancheros. They burned their colors in a symbolic act of rebellion and sought recognition from the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in the United States. The Americans approved, and the first Australian Bandidos chapter was born in Sydney. The move enraged Ross and the remaining Comancheros, who viewed it as both treachery and an American invasion. From that moment, tensions spiraled. Both clubs fought for dominance, not just against each other, but also against other outlaw gangs, such as the Hells Angels and the Rebels. The conflicts escalated into full-blown war in August 1984, after a heated phone call between Spencer and Ross effectively declared open hostilities. On September 2, 1984, Father's Day in Australia, the British Motorcycle Club hosted a family-friendly swap meet at the Viking Tavern in Milperra, a suburb of Sydney. It was meant to be a community event, complete with food, music, and families with children. But the simmering war between the Comancheros and the newly formed Bandidos was about to boil over. That morning, Bandidos confronted Comanchero member Glenn Eves, challenging him to a confrontation. The confrontation happened in a parking lot, and both parties arrived armed. Both sides lined up, staring each other down across the lot. At the height of the standoff, Comanchero leader Jock Ross waved a machete and gave the order, "Kill 'em all!" The parking lot erupted into chaos. In less than 10 minutes, the battle left 7 people dead, 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and a 14-year-old girl. Police were called. Over 200 officers reached the scene, but it was too late. 20 others were wounded. The brutal confrontation would forever be remembered as the Milperra Massacre. The massacre made international headlines. It was proof that the Bandidos were now a force in Australia. Rumors spread in the aftermath, including a false theory that the young girl killed was not actually Leanne Walters, but another girl carrying her ID. Dental records later confirmed her identity, putting those rumors to rest. The Milpera massacre cemented Anthony Snodgrass Spencer's place in outlaw history. A man shaped by a tragic childhood had risen to lead Australia's first Bandidos chapter, sparking one of the bloodiest biker wars the country had ever seen. His decisions on that Father's Day left a legacy written in blood, marking the Bandidos' arrival on the global outlaw stage. The Milpera massacre showed just how violent the Bandidos' arrival in Australia could be. But years later, another figure would rise from the same scene, a feared enforcer whose reputation was built on surviving ambushes and carrying out brutal orders. Number 1. Toby Mitchell. Toby Mitchell's name became synonymous with outlaw violence in Australia. A former kickboxer and nightclub identity, he eventually rose to one of the most feared positions in the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, Sergeant-at-Arms of the Victorian chapter. His reputation was built on fear and violence. In 2011, Mitchell survived an ambush outside a gym near the Bandidos Brunswick clubhouse. Hit by 6 bullets, he lost a kidney, gallbladder, and much of his liver. But he lived, and his survival only added to his legend. Less than 2 years later, in 2013, he was shot again, this time in the arm as he entered the clubhouse of the Diablos, a Bandidos support club. The attack was never solved, but it cemented his image as a marked man in Australia's biker wars. By 2013, Mitchell stepped away from the Bandidos, citing health issues and growing disputes. He was arrested multiple times for assaults, public brawls, and affrays. Though no longer wearing the red and gold patch, his reputation as the Bandidos' former enforcer followed him everywhere. Mitchell later joined the Mongols Motorcycle Club, showing how shifting allegiances in Australia's biker scene often reignite old rivalries. His social media presence and celebrity status made him one of the most public outlaw bikers in the country and one of the most polarizing. As tensions escalated, another name carved itself into history, a brotherhood built on rebellion and a legacy forged in conflict: the Outlaws. Here are the 10 most dangerous outlaws MCs in history. Harry Joseph Taco Bowman. Harry Joseph Taco Bowman was among the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, and in 1999, agents raided a quiet Michigan home and finally took him down. But the story of how Bowman earned that spot runs deeper than a simple arrest. In 1991, Bowman gave the order to kill Raymond "Bear" Chaffin, a former outlaw who left the club for the Warlocks and sided with the Hells Angels. To Bowman, it was betrayal. He picked Alex "Dirt" Ankerick to fix Raymond. The plan was clear: win Chaffin's trust, then kill him at the right time. Ankerick followed through. He gained Raymond's trust successfully. He even stayed at Chaffin's house, and when he got the chance, he pulled the trigger. 4 quiet shots to the back of Chaffin's head ended his life. To ensure the message was heard, newspaper clippings of the murder were sent to outlaw chapters across the country, much like trophies. And as a reward, Ankerick earned his full patch in the club. But Bowman's violence wasn't only for rivals. He turned it on his own men, too. During Daytona Bike Week in 1992, former Outlaws probate Erwin Hitler Nissen made the mistake of fighting with the Outlaws' Atlanta president James "Moose" McClain. The next morning, Bowman had him dragged into a motel room. After a round of kicks and punches, Bowman gave the order to get rid of him. Nissen was thrown off a 3-story balcony. He lived, but with broken bones and scars that stayed with him for life. And when someone tried to snitch, Bowman showed the same ruthlessness. In 1993, Kevin "Turbo" Talley was arrested in Canada and forced to sign a statement admitting the Outlaws were a criminal enterprise. When Bowman found out, Talley was lured to Detroit, locked in the clubhouse, and confronted face to face, and days of intimidation followed before he was sent back to Florida under threat of a savage beating. Knowing what awaited him, Talley quit before Bowman could finish the job. But what made Bowman's era so dangerous wasn't just the number of lives lost. It was how he turned the Outlaws into a war machine. Under him, kidnappings, killings, and bombings spread across state lines. Bowman was brutal to his own men, but a few years later, another name rose, one who didn't even spare the elderly. With him, every room he entered turned into a battlefield. Randall Madman Miller. In 1993, over a $15 pocket change dispute, Randall Madman Miller and his accomplice murdered 74-year-old Morris Gager and his wife, Ruth, in their workshop in Illinois. And without any suspicion, they got away with murder. But what happened next to the Gager family was beyond anyone's imagination. The horror didn't end with the demise of two family members. Gager's son, Gary Gauger, who made the 911 call and reported murders to the police, came under investigation, and soon the police convicted him of double homicide. Under pressure, he gave a false confession and was sentenced to death for killing his own parents. He spent 2 years in prison and 9 months on death row. He sat on death row awaiting execution until, in a twist of fate, Miller's accomplice finally came forward in court and told the truth. What makes Miller's crime so horrible wasn't just the brutality, but also the fallout. 2 elderly lives were stolen in cold blood, and an innocent son was nearly executed for a crime he didn't commit. Miller showed no mercy for the couple he killed, and no remorse for the man whose life he nearly destroyed. His name is etched in outlaw history as one of the coldest, most dangerous men ever to wear the patch. Miller's cruelty happened behind closed doors, but the next outlaw brought the same violence into the open streets for everyone to see. Robert Spaziano. Robert Spaziano, known on the streets as Crazy Joe, carried a reputation that even scared fellow outlaws. In 1974, Spaziano assaulted a 16-year-old girl in Orange County. He and a friend lured her into their truck with the promise of marijuana and took her to the Outlaws clubhouse, where she was beaten and assaulted until she lost consciousness. But Spaziano's crimes didn't stop there. A few years later, the skeletal remains of 2 women were found in a Florida dump. A teenager came forward and told investigators that Spaziano had bragged about mutilating women and had even taken him to the dump to show where the bodies were left to rot. The horror of Spaziano's crimes earned him the death penalty at trial. Spaziano's record told its own story: violent felonies, witness intimidation, and suspicions of murders that never reached trial. Wherever his name appeared, violence followed. His death sentence was eventually overturned on legal grounds, but that technicality didn't erase his legacy. And if Spaziano represented the predatory side of the club, the next outlaw would mastermind the organized campaign of terror that would burn cities. Jack Rosga, Milwaukee Jack. April 17, 2010, what was supposed to be a charity ride called the Flood Run exploded into chaos. Outlaws bikers from Wisconsin, riding under the command of their national president, Jack Rosga Milwaukee Jack, crossed into Minnesota and ambushed a group of Hell's Angels. The Angels were beaten to the pavement, stripped of their jackets, and left bleeding while the Outlaws carried off their colors like trophies. Under Rosga's leadership, violence became the Outlaws' defining characteristic. One of the most notorious streaks of violence included the Cycle Expo in Virginia in 2006, the Dinwiddie Racetrack in 2008, and the Cockades Bar in Petersburg in 2009, where the Outlaws teamed up with the Pagans. Fights also broke out at Daytona Bike Week that same year, and at the Charlotte Easy Rider Expo in 2010. Each of these events exploded into gang warfare. And when the Outlaws established a clubhouse in Rock Hill, South Carolina, the Hells Angels considered their own presence to have pushed the conflict to the edge. By the end of 2009, a Hells Angel in Maine had been shot in a hit that nearly killed him. Under Rosga's leadership, the club wasn't just fighting. They were running drugs, moving weapons, and building a criminal network that stretched across states, all under his control. When he was finally caught, Rosga admitted to undercover agents that he always knew prison would be his fate. He was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. And while Rosga built his reputation through planned operations, the next name on the list created his legacy with a different kind of violence. Stuart Dink Dawson. It was November 11th, 2008, when UK police pulled over a van traveling from South Wales to North Wales and uncovered nearly 2 kilos of amphetamine hidden in the roof lining. It was worth around £20,000 on the street at that time. At first, it appeared to be a single bust, but investigators quickly realized it was part of a larger structure. Just months earlier, another vehicle had been intercepted with the same quantity of drugs. At the center of both runs was Stuart "Dink" Dawson, the European president of the Outlaws MC. He was the highest-ranking member outside the United States, and he was using that position to traffic drugs across the UK. Surveillance showed Dawson meeting with Outlaws chapters in North and West Wales. It was Stuart who was arranging shipments, setting deals, and maintaining the supply chain. When police raided the Colwyn Bay clubhouse, they uncovered even more drugs, including cocaine tied to the manager running the bar. In total, Dawson and 6 others were caught moving more than £40,000 worth of amphetamine. The judge who sentenced him didn't hold back, saying, "You used your role as European president to further your own criminal activities. You brought the organization into disrepute by the wholesale and commercial supply of drugs." And while Dawson's downfall exposed how high-level leadership could be stripped of power, the following figure showed how far the Outlaws were willing to go when they turned entire cities into battlefields. John Scott Killip. Oklahoma in the 1980s was prime territory for the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Drug money was flowing, violence kept rivals in line, and at the center of it all was John Scott Killip, better known as Lil Wolf. Killip was the man pulling strings across the Oklahoma City chapter, tying together drug pipelines, kidnapping jobs, and a network of outlaws who enforced business with fists, knives, and guns. The case files read like a roadmap of organized crime. Belleville drug deals, Fort Smith trafficking runs, and constant links to fellow outlaws like Teague, Kraut, Adams, Nelson, and Pfaff. Wherever investigators looked, Lil Wolf's name kept coming up. By 1985, the government was ready to strike. The RICO trial dragged the Oklahoma chapter into federal court, laying bare its hierarchy and reach. Hangarounds, probates, patched members, they all played their part. But Killip had climbed above the system, using the club's national network to move narcotics and keep control. The verdict hit hard. While some outlaws walked on specific charges, Killip was convicted of both substantive RICO violations and the larger conspiracy. It marked him as one of the central figures in Oklahoma's outlaw underworld. For law enforcement, it was a big win. For the outlaws, it only added to the legend. Lil Wolf's name became another reminder of how far the club would go to guard its turf and keep the drug money flowing. Some are dead, others locked away, and a few still roam free. But one thing hasn't changed. God forgives. Outlaws don't. Stephen "Sticky Steve" Morris. Stephen "Sticky Steve" Morris ran a drug pipeline for 15 years, moving thousands of kilos of marijuana into St. Louis, stretching across Indiana, Missouri, Illinois, and Colorado. Morris and 14 others were eventually indicted, and he landed a 12-year federal sentence for drug conspiracy. But the drugs were only one part of the story. Court records tied the invaders' circle to 3 brutal murders that still haunt the Midwest outlaw scene. On August 30th, 2007, bikers Randy Greenman and George Witter disappeared after leaving a bar in St. Louis County. They weren't just killed. Their remains were later found in pieces, spread across different places. That same year, another man, Alan Henry Little, vanished without a trace. He's believed to be dead, with investigators quietly linking his case to the same network. No one was ever charged, but sealed court files show police getting close, hinting at charges that never came. For Morris and the invaders, bikes and drugs were only part of the story. Their real power came from fear, territory controlled not just by reputation, but by bodies, silence, and violence that still hangs over the Midwest. And if Morris symbolized how outlaw networks mix drugs with death, the next Outlaw's story would push that same blend into even more explosive territory. Peter "Big Pete" James. Chicago in the mid-1990s wasn't just loud with Harleys. It was rocked by bombs, drive-bys, and bar fights that left men bleeding in the street. The Hells Angels were trying to take the city, and the Outlaws fought them block by block. But the real war was inside. Cliques turned on each other, leaders went down on charges, and the brotherhood was falling apart. That's when Peter "Big Pete" James stepped in. Big Pete didn't just join the Outlaws, he took them over. He crushed rival crews, pulled them together, and built an army under his control. Chicago became his fortress. Smaller gangs were absorbed, mafia ties grew stronger, and even the Hells Angels were forced into a truce. For almost 20 years, his word was law. But power doesn't last forever. Cancer wore him down, his grip weakened, and the soldiers who once feared him started pushing back. By 2015, the empire he had built had cracked apart, and Big Pete stepped away. What made him infamous wasn't just how he ruled, but how he broke the code. Instead of prison or a bullet, he walked away alive, publishing The Last Chicago Boss and exposing the wars, the deals, and the betrayals inside the Outlaws MC. To some, he was a survivor. To others, a traitor. But one truth remains. Big Pete was the man who kept the Angels out of Chicago and lived to tell the story. Frank James. When federal prosecutors went after the Tampa chapter of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, one name stood out. Frank James Wheeler, age 61. He wasn't just another biker. They said he was running a war machine. Bombings, murders, extortion. Prosecutors claimed Wheeler ordered it all in a bloody fight against the Hells Angels. His hunger for power was so strong that he stopped caring if new recruits even rode motorcycles. Instead, he pulled in street thugs, turning them into soldiers for the Outlaws' war. The violence wasn't random. It was planned. In June 1994, police uncovered what they called a war wagon, an RV packed with guns, ammo, and bulletproof vests. It was ready for an ambush against an Angels-affiliated club on the Indiana-Illinois border. And under Wheeler's command, loyalty was proven with blood. Prosecutors told how one probationary member earned his patch by murdering a rival Hells henchman. He shot him, beat him with the gun, then stabbed him in the neck with a screwdriver. It wasn't spontaneous, it was ordered from the top. By the time Wheeler faced trial, prosecutors laid out decades of organized warfare. He may not have pulled the trigger, but they painted him as the man giving the orders. In the end, James Lee Wheeler was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He faced at least 10 years and possibly life behind bars. On a quiet morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, the sound of motorcycles was replaced by the pounding of boots and the battering of battering rams. Local deputies and federal agents moved in fast, surrounding the Outlaws Motorcycle Club's headquarters. Their target wasn't just another patched member. It was Mark Lester, the 55-year-old regional president of the Outlaws in Tennessee. Lester's arrest was part of a sweeping national roundup, one of the largest ever aimed at the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Federal prosecutors had unsealed a 12-count indictment out of the Eastern District of Virginia. Accusing the club of being more than a gang, it was a criminal enterprise with a strict hierarchy, a military-style chain of command that stretched from local chapters all the way to the national president, Jack Rosgaw, better known in biker circles as Milwaukee Jack. The indictment painted a picture of a violent, organized network that thrived on intimidation. The charges ranged from attempted murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery, to drug trafficking, gambling rings, and weapons violations. A total of 27 outlaws across 7 states were named in the operation. For Lester, the walls had been closing in long before the indictment dropped. On New Year's Eve, the Knox County Sheriff's Office raided the Outlaws clubhouse on Clifton Road. That raid was sparked by a shocking allegation that Lester and fellow member Kenneth Foster had kidnapped and robbed an undercover officer who had managed to infiltrate the gang. According to investigators, the officer's cover was blown, and the Outlaws did what they had always done to suspected informants. They moved with violence. Lester's power inside the Outlaws was not to be underestimated. As regional president, he wasn't just running a chapter. He was overseeing multiple crews across Tennessee, giving orders that filtered down into drug pipelines, weapons movement, and violent enforcement. His reach extended from local bars and back roads to interstate operations, where outlaw bikers moved product and laundered cash while keeping rivals in check with fists, knives, and guns. Jack Rosga at the top, regional bosses like Lester holding the middle, and local presidents managing the ground level. The Outlaws were run like a business, a criminal corporation whose product was drugs, fear, and control. And as prosecutors told it, men like Lester were the key to keeping that system intact. For law enforcement, it was proof that even the most insulated leaders could be reached. For the Outlaws, it was a dangerous crack in the chain of command. Yet, like so many cases against the Outlaws, Lester's story didn't end with his arrest. The charges were only part of a much larger effort to dismantle the club's national infrastructure. Federal agents knew that locking up men like Lester wasn't just about punishment. It was about cutting the head off the snake, one regional boss at a time. But with leaders like Mark Lester taken down in coordinated raids, the balance of power was shifting. The Outlaws had built their empire on loyalty, violence, and silence. Now, one of their highest-ranking men in Tennessee was behind bars, and the brotherhood he helped enforce was under siege. While Western clubs fought for dominance, a new kind of biker power was rising in the East. Their strength came from the state itself, led by men loyal not just to the road, but to the Kremlin. Meet the Night Wolves, Putin's Hell's Angels. It was the mid-1980s. As the Soviet Union began to weaken, an underground culture started to take shape. Young men on old Soviet motorcycles gathered at band rock concerts and secret parties. For them, it was a rare taste of freedom in a country where Western music and style were forbidden. They rode through Moscow's streets on their battered bikes, often chased by police who saw them as troublemakers. By the late 1980s, they had already carved out a place in the city's underground scene. But the turning point came in 1989, when Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms loosened restrictions across Soviet society.
What changed Mikhail Gorbachev? What made you able to turn a place that didn't have freedom into freedom? What did it to you?
Suddenly, groups that once operated in secret could step into the open. Among them was Alexander Zaldostanov, known as the Surgeon. He used this new freedom to form a biker club he called the Night Wolves. He got this idea during the 1980s, when Zaldostanov had spent time in Berlin. There, he saw the structure and brotherhood of Western biker clubs up close. Inspired, he returned to Moscow with a vision: to blend biker culture with a distinctly Russian identity. Under his leadership, the Night Wolves adopted leather vests, patches, and strict rules of membership, but added their own twist of nationalism, Orthodox Christianity, and Soviet nostalgia. At first, the Wolves were rebels against the Soviet system itself, but in 1991, everything changed. In August 1991, hardline elements of the Soviet army launched a coup against Gorbachev. Crowds poured into the streets to defend democracy, and among them stood the Night Wolves, siding with the protesters and helping defend the Russian parliament. That moment marked their transformation from outlaws on the fringe into political players, and it opened the door to cooperation with the state. Ideology, values, and activities. At the core of the Night Wolves' identity is Russian nationalism. To them, the West represents moral decay and a threat to Russian society. In contrast, they promote Orthodox Christianity, loyalty to the Kremlin, and nostalgia for the Soviet past, especially the Soviet victory in World War II. These ideas shape their speeches, rallies, and carefully staged public shows. One of their most visible traditions is organizing massive motorcycle rallies and patriotic festivals. Every year, they lead the Victory Day Ride, celebrating the Red Army's triumph over Nazi Germany. These rides often cross borders into countries like Belarus, Slovakia, and even Germany, turning the event into both a spectacle and a political statement. Structure, membership, and internal rules. The Night Wolves are more like an organization built around one man, and Alexander the Surgeon Zaldostanov stands at the top of it. Besides being the leader, he is the voice and strategist of the group. His authority filters down through a strict hierarchy, giving the Wolves the feel of a military unit rather than a social club, as it was originally. From their headquarters in Moscow, the Wolves spread rapidly across Russia, planting chapters in Crimea, the Donbass, and the North Caucasus. Their network soon extended beyond Russia's borders, with affiliates in Serbia, Slovakia, Germany, Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Macedonia. Wherever they expand, the message is consistent: Russian pride, Orthodox faith, and unwavering loyalty to the Kremlin. Process of becoming a member. But how can you become a part of Russia's famous MC? Joining the Night Wolves is not an easy task. Entry begins only with an invitation from an existing member. From there, recruits enter a long probation period, much like the prospect stage in Western biker clubs. Once accepted as probationary members, recruits must prove themselves through loyalty, discipline, and active participation in club life. They attend events, follow orders, and show commitment to the club's ideology: Russian nationalism, Orthodox Christianity, and loyalty to the state. This stage usually lasts around 2 years before anyone earns full membership. The Wolves are strict about who they exclude. No drug addicts, no women, no gay men. Leaders emphasize that this is a male-only brotherhood, built on tradition and ideology. Women may join some activities, but never as full members. Besides the main club, there are youth and feeder groups that help train the next generation. These include motorcycle schools, martial arts programs, and patriotic camps where young people are introduced to the Wolves' culture. Most members come from former Soviet states, but the club has also attracted bikers from Serbia and Bosnia, appealing to countries with strong Christian ties. Members wear patches decorated with wolves, Orthodox crosses, and Soviet symbols. Inside, the atmosphere feels less like a motorcycle club and more like a paramilitary unit. Discipline is strict, and participation in rallies, patriotic shows, and religious ceremonies is mandatory. Today, estimates place their strength between 5,000 and 7,000 members worldwide. But the beating heart of the organization remains in Moscow, with Luhansk and Sevastopol gaining special importance during the wars in Ukraine. Relationship with the Russian state. The Night Wolves quickly aligned themselves with Vladimir Putin's political image, becoming one of his most visible allies. Over time, they evolved into a tool of Russian soft power. Through international motorcycle rallies, youth programs, and patriotic shows across Europe and the Balkans, they projected Moscow's message far beyond Russia's borders. For their services to the state, Zaldostanov had been personally honored by Putin and received the Order of Honor medal. Besides that, the Russian government has provided the Wolves with millions of rubles in grants, including around 12 million rubles for a Patriot Youth Center in Sevastopol.
Горжусь его дружбой, и он, значит, во мне пусть видит своего плеча.
The Russian Orthodox Church has also publicly blessed their rides, adding a religious layer to their political message. Putin has appeared with the Night Wolves at several public rallies, the most famous being in 2011 when he rode a trike alongside Alexander, the Surgeon Zaldostanov in Sevastopol. It was the first time a head of state anywhere in the world had openly participated in biker club activities. Putin tapped into their image of masculinity, rebellion, and loyalty to the Russian nation. It was a carefully staged piece of political theater, merging state power with subcultural appeal to craft a new icon of Russian strength.
We begin today with an article by Agency France Press about the Night Wolves, a pro-Putin motorcycle gang from Crimea, which is helping Russian-backed militants in eastern Ukraine.
Role in Ukraine. When Russia moved to annex Crimea in early 2014, the Night Wolves were to help the state. They played an on-the-ground role. Members from the Sevastopol chapter helped establish roadblocks on major routes into the city. They patrolled areas of strategic importance and participated in the seizure of facilities like the Ukrainian Naval Forces headquarters in Sevastopol. Alexander Zaldostanov and other key figures in the club coordinated closely with pro-Russian forces. They distributed propaganda, collected intelligence, and supported civilian self-defense units during the takeover. In the Donbass region, the Wolves' involvement deepened. Local chapters helped organize separatist militias, guarded checkpoints, and in some cases, members fought alongside these forces. Their actions drew international attention, and sanctions followed. The United States, the EU, Canada, and others targeted the Night Wolves and Zaldostanov. These sanctions were imposed due to their involvement in Crimea's annexation, recruitment of fighters, and support for separatist operations in eastern Ukraine. In addition to the military or paramilitary aspects, the Night Wolves deployed soft power. They ran patriotic youth programs, cultural events, rallies, and victory rides to promote a narrative of Russian nationalism. These shows and events are often state-backed, broadcast widely. To mark the 5th anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Night Wolves staged a rally and race between Simferopol and Sevastopol. It wasn't just a ride, it was a celebration of what they called historic justice, a political message wrapped in spectacle. After 2014, the Wolves became cultural defenders of the annexation. Their massive shows in Sevastopol blended music, theater, and military symbolism, drawing tens of thousands. These weren't neutral performances. They were patriotic pageants designed to glorify Russia's takeover. The stance came at a cost internationally. Their support for the annexation landed them on the White House sanctions list. But inside Russia, the story was different. Methods of influence. The Night Wolves use a highly creative set of methods to shape public opinion and influence the youth. Their activities are carefully designed to appeal to Orthodox believers and align with traditional values. One of their most visible strategies is the restoration of religious sites, often in partnership with the Russian Orthodox Church. These efforts present the Wolves as protectors of faith and tradition, reinforcing their alignment with Kremlin-backed religious nationalism. Alongside this, they invest in the construction of cultural centers and youth clubs, which serve as hubs for patriotic education. And how can they forget patriotic activities? They organize annual motorcycle pilgrimages, Victory Day parades, and festivals across Russia and Eastern Europe. To fuel their operations, the Wolves operate as a business network. They run nightclubs, tattoo parlors, and merchandise lines, selling branded clothing and accessories that turn their political identity into a lifestyle. Combat training and paramilitary activities. Combat training holds significant importance for the club, and they are also affiliated with Wolf Holding of Security Structures, WHSS, which is designated by the U.S. Treasury as owned by the Night Wolves Motorcycle Club. Tactical military training not just to Russians, but also to law enforcement, foreign military personnel, and Russian-speaking communities abroad. In Crimea, WHSS operates a self-defense training unit. Ostensibly, these are camps for civilian self-defense. Still, evidence and sanctions suggest the training includes military-style instruction and is used to support paramilitary and security operations in Russia-occupied Ukrainian territory. WHSS also offers more than training. Its services reportedly include armed protection, armored vehicles, installation of surveillance and monitoring systems, and special preparation teams. In areas claimed by or under the influence of pro-Russian forces, such services blur the line between security contractor and para-state actor. Because of these capabilities and its close association with the Russian state and club's leadership, WHSS, the Night Wolves, had been sanctioned by Western governments. Chapters. Today, this motorcycle club operates in 51 chapters worldwide, spreading its influence across Russia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. Russia remains its stronghold, and its presence is deeply tied to nationalism and loyalty to Vladimir Putin. The group regularly participates in pro-Kremlin rallies, and their leader, Alexander Zaldostanov, even served as a torchbearer at the 2014 Sochi Olympics. By 2016, they had around 5,000 members in Russia alone, making them a significant cultural and political force. Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 2018, the Night Wolves launched a tour of the Western Balkans, focusing heavily on Republika Srpska, a Serb-majority region of Bosnia and Herzegovina with strong pro-Russian leanings. The president of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, awarded Zaldostanov a Medal of Honor for his loyalty to Russia. The Wolves also joined parades marking Republika Srpska Day, a holiday organized by Bosnian Serbs. This event is controversial, and in 2015, Bosnia's constitutional court declared it unconstitutional, deepening divisions in the region. Bulgaria. The Wolves' activities in Bulgaria have raised serious concerns within the European Union. Members frequently attend events hosted by the Russian embassy. In 2016, demonstrations against their arrival turned violent as pro-Russian nationalists clashed with anti-Wolves campaigners. While the bikers themselves weren't directly involved, their presence was the clear catalyst for unrest. Montenegro. In Montenegro, they operate under the motto, "Pray to God and stick to Russia." Authorities accused some of their members of involvement in a 2016 assassination plot against then Prime Minister Milo Đukanović, which prosecutors linked to Kremlin efforts to stop Montenegro from joining NATO. The Wolves have also attempted to shut down pro-Ukrainian rallies, claiming such demonstrations would promote warmongering rhetoric and religious intolerance. In 2014, they carried out a motorcycle pilgrimage in Montenegro as part of their Russian Balkan tour, an event actively promoted by the Russian embassy in Podgorica, underscoring how closely their activities align with Russian state interests. Ukraine. The Wolves' role in Ukraine has always been in the limelight. In March 2014, they traveled to Crimea, where they set up roadblocks, collected intelligence, and spread propaganda during Russia's takeover. They openly supported the Kremlin narrative that so-called Ukrainian fascists, backed by the CIA, had toppled a legitimate pro-Russian government. Following the annexation, the Night Wolves were awarded a municipal security contract in Bakhchisarai, granting them authority in local policing and youth patriotic education programs. Given their proven loyalty and direct involvement in Crimea, it is widely believed that the Wolves have continued to play some role in Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, even if their activities are less openly acknowledged. A tool of Russian soft power. So far, they have transitioned to a proxy for Kremlin influence instead of purely being a biker club. Their rides, shows, and youth camps may look like biker culture, but they double as political theater. Much of their messaging revolves around World War II victory narratives, tying Crimea and Donbass to historical justice. Now they're soft power on wheels, projecting Moscow's worldview across Europe. Prominent members. Alexander Zaldostanov, the surgeon. Founder and undisputed leader Zaldostanov remains the face of the Night Wolves. Born in 1963 in Kirovohrad, USSR, now Ukraine, to a Ukrainian father and a Russian doctor mother, his family spent time in Crimea before settling in Moscow. Beyond his medical nickname, he is best known for turning the club into a vehicle of Kremlin propaganda. Awarded the Order of Honor by Vladimir Putin, sanctioned by the EU, and banned from Europe under his guidance, the Wolves shift from rebellious outsiders to state-backed nationalists. Vitaly Kishkinov, the prosecutor. Kishkinov is heading the Donbass branch after previously commanding the Luhansk chapter. A hardliner, he fuses biker culture with militant separatism. In 2019, he received a war medal from the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic, where he now serves in its People's Council. Known for fiery nationalist speeches, he enforces an exclusionary code. No women, no gay men, no drug users. He is under European Union sanctions for undermining Ukraine's territorial integrity. Sergei Komarov, Mosquito. He is a Luhansk chapter member. Komarov is recognized for his combat record with pro-Russian separatist militias. Born outside Moscow, he fought as a tank man in the Chechen Wars, an experience that left lasting scars. Among fellow Wolves, he is known as energetic and friendly, But his past reflects the club's transformation from a biker subculture into frontline fighters. Denis Kuznetsov, deputy commander of the Luhansk chapter, Kuznetsov joined the Wolves in the early 1990s. After the 2013-14 Maidan protests, which he viewed as a Western-backed coup, he left his family in Moscow to join Russia's annexation of Crimea. Under his leadership, Wolves helped set up checkpoints, patrolled Sevastopol, and armed themselves for the takeover. Kuznetsov later admitted, "I am one of the million reasons Crimea was annexed. The United States sanctioned the group for these activities." Ramzan Kadyrov, the powerful Chechen leader and Putin loyalist, was made an honorary member and granted branch leader status. His association elevates the Wolves beyond biker culture, aligning them with Russia's broader ultranationalist project. Controversies and criticism. The Night Wolves have long drawn criticism for far-right nationalism, anti-LGBT rhetoric, and Soviet nostalgia. Their use of Stalin portraits during rides is praised by supporters as honoring history, but seen by critics as whitewashing repression. Their activities have had real consequences. In 2014, the U.S. sanctioned the group and its leader, Alexander Zaldostanov, for threatening Ukraine's sovereignty. Canada blacklisted them in 2015, and the EU followed in 2022. Poland blocked their 2015 Victory Day ride over Crimea, while Germany also attempted to ban them before a Berlin court overturned the decision. Local branches have raised alarms too. In Slovakia, officials fined the group for building a fortified compound with armored vehicles. How their supporters see them. They might be rebellious to their critics, but their supporters see them as patriots, not criminals. For them, they are a spiritual army, defending Russia's history, faith, and traditions. Their rallies, youth camps, and concerts are framed as cultural celebrations, not politics. Critics, especially in the West, see something else. A paramilitary tool dressed as a biker club, spreading Kremlin propaganda and intolerance under the guise of patriotism. Inside Russia, they're cultural heroes. Outside, they're sanctioned and banned. This divide makes the Wolves a reflection of Russia itself, admired by some, feared by others. The Night Wolves began as a biker club, but today they stand as a fusion of culture, politics, and power. Their story shows how subcultures can evolve into tools of the state. As the most powerful club in the world, the Hells Angels have always stood at the center of it all. Yet even the most feared brotherhoods have enemies. Some sought alliance, others open war. All were determined to challenge the Angels' reign, the most dangerous enemies of the Hells Angels. Chapter 1. Jaybird Dobbins.
My name is Jay Dobbins. I'm a retired undercover federal agent, and I infiltrated the Hells Angels.
There is nothing more dangerous to an outlaw club than a traitor within. In the early 2000s, that traitor was an undercover ATF agent named Jaybird Dobbins. His assignment was to enter the Hells Angels during Operation Black Biscuit and gain their trust. At first, he was only an outsider watching from the edge, but the deeper he went, the more the club pushed him. They wanted proof that he was loyal. They wanted blood. The test came when the Angels told Dobbins to kill a rival from the Mongols motorcycle club. It was the moment that would decide whether he would be seen as one of them or cast out as a fraud. Dobbins turned to his team. Together they staged a killing so convincing that it fooled the Angels. A man dressed in Mongol colors was covered with animal blood and butchered meat. Photos were taken of his body in a shallow grave. A bloody vest was mailed from Mexico, as if the murder had been carried out across the border. The Angels believed every word. In their eyes, he was now a man who had killed for the club. Doors that had always been closed opened to him. Meetings, secrets, plans. He was inside. What the Angels did not know was that every detail was being passed back to the ATF. The staged murder was more than theater. It was a key that unlocked indictments. Evidence flowed from Dobbins to federal agents, drugs, weapons, violence, racketeering. The operation grew until prosecutors had enough to bring down dozens of members. For a moment, the Angels were not only exposed, they were vulnerable. But the success came with a cost. When his cover finally cracked, Dobbins was no longer the trusted brother. He was the traitor. the club saw betrayal. To them, it was worse than a rival gang. It was poison from within. Dobbins did not walk away clean. His family was threatened. His home was firebombed. J. Bird Dobbins proved that the most dangerous enemy of the Hells Angels was the man sitting at their table, the man who fooled them. And in the end, the story of his infiltration was not just about what it cost the Angels, it was about what it cost him and his family. Chapter 2. Officer David Miller. The Hells Angels have faced rivals for decades, but sometimes their most dangerous enemies come from men with a badge. In Colorado, a body camera revealed just how far that danger could go. Officer David Miller of the LaSalle Police Department pulled over Anthony Mills, a member of the Hells Angels, for speeding. It should have ended with a ticket. Instead, it became something far darker. Miller told fellow officers to switch off their cameras before they traded stories about violent encounters with the Hells Angels. But Miller forgot one important detail. His own body camera was still running. What it captured was not a routine stop. It was evidence of a threat. "If this guy does something I do not like," Miller joked, "I am shooting him. I need some paid vacation." The words were framed as humor. But for Anthony Mills, they carried the weight of life and death. Therefore, the Mills fought back through the courts. In 2022, he filed a lawsuit against 5 Colorado police agencies, accusing Miller and others of misconduct. The case dragged on for 2 years, but by 2024, the agencies settled. They paid Mills $25,000 and issued a public apology. Miller resigned from the force. The resignation was not only an admission of a career ended in disgrace, it was proof that words spoken in carelessness can have lasting consequences. Because the threat came from a police officer, not a rival biker, it reminded them that power in a uniform could be even more dangerous than a rival gang with a patch. Chapter 3. Hunter S. Thompson. Sometimes words cut deeper than blades. In the 1960s, a young journalist named Hunter S. Thompson stepped into the world of the Hells Angels. He was not a biker. He was not part of the Brotherhood. He was a writer who wanted to understand the club and tell its story to the outside world. At first, the Angels welcomed him. They treated him as a curious outsider who could drink with them and ride beside them. Because he showed respect and did not judge them, they allowed him close. For months, he lived their life. He joined their runs, shared their parties, and watched their chaos up close. But Thompson was not just observing, he was taking notes. The Angels did not yet realize what that meant. Thompson was not there to glorify them. He was building a record of their violence, their crime, and their cruelty. He listened as they bragged about fights. He saw how women were treated. Because of that, the relationship turned sour. The breaking point came after months of riding with them. Thompson had become too honest. He spoke openly about the abuse he had seen, especially against women. He refused to turn a blind eye. That act of defiance sealed his fate. One night, the Angels turned on him. He was beaten nearly to death by the same men who had once shared food and drink with him. The message was simple: words could get you killed. Therefore, when Thompson published his book, Hells Angels, the strange and terrible saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. In 1966, the Angels saw it as a final betrayal. The book was a sensation. It showed readers the raw brutality of the club. It stripped away the myth and revealed the violence beneath the leather and patches. He had taken their secrets and turned them into a public spectacle. And for the Angels, the price of betrayal was blood. In their eyes, Thompson was no longer a writer. He was a traitor who had used their trust as a weapon against them. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who sits quietly, listens, and then tells the world what he has seen. His book made him a legend, but it also made him a permanent target of one of the most feared outlaw clubs in America. Chapter 4. Judge Samuel Conti. If the Angels had a king, it was Sonny Barger. But if Barger had an enemy, it was Judge Samuel Conti. In 1979 and 1980, Conti presided over a brutal racketeering trial targeting the Hells Angels. The case lasted 9 months, and because he refused to bend under pressure, federal marshals had to protect him and his family from threats. Conti was not content to be just the arbiter. He delivered sentences that struck at the club's heart. dismantling Barger's power in Oakland. Though the jury initially hung on many counts, Conti declared a mistrial in August 1980 and set a new date. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Angels escaped accountability, their violence would spread unchecked. Because Conti took no shortcuts, the Angels saw him as more than a judge. To Hell's Angels, he was an enemy who imposed order, but the power of his rulings made him a target. He was nicknamed Hanging Sam by critics for his tough sentencing, especially toward violent crime. He earned a reputation for being unwavering and for being one man who would stare down a club built on intimidation. Therefore, when the Angels plotted retaliation, they knew it would be costly, but the price was his resolve. The judgments from his bench weakened their structure and sent a message. No one is untouchable. For Barger, for the Angels, Conti represented the limit of power. Their rival in robes, not leather, who used sentences as his weapon. In the end, the clash between Barger and Conti became legendary in outlaw lore. It was not just a fight for legal dominance. It was a fight over whether the club itself would answer to the law. Judge Conti proved that even a king of the bikers could be forced to bend before the bench. Chapter 5. Anthony Tate. Anthony Tate was not just a patch holder in the Hells Angels. He became one of their greatest threats. In 1984, he volunteered to become a paid FBI informant while still holding a full patch in the Hells Angels. The dual life gave him access that few outsiders ever saw. Because he was trusted, he walked into leadership rooms wearing a hidden wire. He recorded meetings, drug deals, explosive plots, and violence planning. The tapes he supplied helped bring down top Angels. His work was critical in the federal case against Sonny Barger, as evidence from his recordings supported Barger's conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. Tate's infiltration fueled the broader Operation Cactus that led to sweeping raids across multiple states. In November 1987, these raids resulted in 38 arrests from Hells Angels chapters in Alaska and beyond. But betrayal comes at a price. The Angels hate traitors more than rivals. Once his role was exposed, his life changed forever. He could not return to the fold. He had become the enemy within. The club would never forget. Tate's brilliance lay not in violence, but in silence. Anthony Tate's legacy is not only in the indictments he helped unleash, but in the paranoia he planted deep within the Hells Angels. Because one man dared to record, many fell. Chapter 6. Sergeant Detective Guy Ouellette. In the 2000s, the Hells Angels held sway over Montreal's streets, but one man stood against them. Sergeant Detective Guy Ouellette of the Quebec Provincial Police spent decades building a web of surveillance, wiretaps, and flipped bikers. He had no illusions. The Angels were powerful, but he believed knowledge could break them. Because he studied their structure, he knew how they operated. Ouellette became part of the Carcajou tactical team in 1995 during Quebec's biker war. He tracked alliances, watched who was rising, who was dropping, and who could be turned. He pushed through raids that shattered drug networks. He flipped insiders. He delivered evidence from the inner workings of the Angels' world. His depth of awareness was legendary. Within the SQ, he was considered a walking encyclopedia of biker politics. He did more than police. He became a Crown's witness in multiple trials. His testimony sent notorious bikers, including Maurice "Mom" Boucher, behind bars. In internal documents introduced at a 2002 trial, it was revealed that in 1999, the Hells Angels held a meeting specifically to plot ways to discredit him. They realized that Ouellette's evidence threatened their very survival. Because he refused to back down, the club watched him. His strategic mind let them move pieces on the board of biker crime that others could not see. Therefore, Ouellette's fight wasn't just about arresting members. It was about dismantling the myth of invulnerability that the Angels held over Quebec. Chapter 7. Joseph Bonavolonta. One man stood between Hells Angels and their wealth. That man was Joseph Bonavolonta, an FBI financial crimes agent whose target was not violence, it was dollars. He didn't chase guns or drugs. He followed paper trails. He tracked shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers. he discovered laundering schemes tied to Angels chapters in New Jersey and beyond. Because the club relied on cash to fuel its power, attacking finances struck at its foundation. Under Bonavolanta's leadership, the Newark Division's Corporate Securities Fraud Squad brought major cases like Nevin Shapir, a billion-dollar Ponzi scheme tied to a University of Miami football booster, and Wise Guy Tickets, a computer intrusion case targeting Ticketmaster systems. He also oversaw Louis Berger Group, a $65 million corporate plea involving reconstruction contracts abroad. Those high-profile cases showed his reach, but he also turned his methods inward, tracing money that moved through Angels' shell fronts. As evidence grew, he helped choke off the club's ability to move cash freely. Convictions followed, banks froze accounts, and revenue streams stalled. The Angels saw that violence could be fought, but finances were a different war. Therefore, Bonavolanta became one of their deadliest foes. He didn't need to draw a gun. He used ledgers, subpoenas, and forensic accounting to dismantle operations. Chapter 8. Ali Osman.
Wir sind hier, wir bleiben hier und egal was passiert, egal wer schießt und bombt und macht und tut,
Yildiray Keymaz, also known by the alias Ali Osman, once claimed publicly that the rival Hells Angels MC in Duisburg would soon cease to exist. A bold threat from the head of Satudara Duisburg MC. He and his secretary, Baris Tepe, were deeply involved in trafficking. Between May 2012 and April 2013, they orchestrated the importation of some 21 kilograms of marijuana and up to 2 kilograms of cocaine. But Keymaz's ambitions were not content with drugs. He and Tepe allegedly acquired war-grade weapons in the Netherlands, including an AK-74 rifle with 2 magazines and a cache of 1,130 rounds of ammunition. For Keymaz, this was a power play. He would be ready for war, not just trade. With that arsenal in hand, in August 2013, under his orders, a hand grenade was thrown at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Duisburg-Rheinhausen. And as if to send a message, another club member, supplied with a submachine gun, opened fire in a restaurant run by Hells Angels. The public blast, the gunfire, the threat, all calculated to break the Hells Angels' hold over the area. Because Keymaz combined brazen public threats with real firepower, the stakes were high on both sides. The Angels could not appear weak, but escalating to war meant lives would be lost, allegiances tested, and law enforcement would close in more closely. Ultimately, law enforcement did act. During investigations, authorities discovered that Keymaz had been arrested in April 2013. They searched his property and found a loaded assault rifle. He later cooperated with prosecutors under a witness rule, revealing the names of fellow members and providing testimony in court. The court in Duisburg convicted him, sentencing him to 6.5 years in prison for a string of offenses, including arms trafficking, drug dealing, and orchestrated attacks. But his sentence came only after he struck a deal, and even then, the memory of that grenade, that gunfire, and the public vow against the Angels would never fade. In the end, Keymaz's strategy was bold. Provoke your enemy into overreaction, then survive by cooperation. But he gambled with lives, territory, and legacy. The Hells Angels did not forget the challenge, and the neighborhood would never forget the explosions and bullets. In that conflict, he became one of the most dangerous non-angel adversaries in their history. Chapter 9. Noel Harder. Harder grew up in Saskatoon under trauma and violence. His stepfather once shot his dog in front of him when he was only 4 years old. Later, after his older brother Donnie died swallowing a ruptured bag of cocaine, Noel stepped into the drug trade himself, rising quickly through Saskatchewan's underworld. He became one of the province's most prominent dealers, closely connected to the Fallen Saints Motorcycle Club, a Hells Angels support crew. By the early 2000s, Harder wore the Fallen Saints jacket proudly. He was trusted in meetings, in deals, and in biker circles. What no one knew was that police had already caught him with a stash of guns in his car and given him a choice: face prison or work for them. Harder agreed to cooperate. For months, he lived a double life. Outwardly, he was a senior Fallen Saint. Secretly, he was recording meetings, collecting evidence, and delivering intelligence that would cripple the Angels network. In January 2015, police launched Project Forsetti, a wave of raids across Western Canada that seized hundreds of guns and more than $8 million worth of drugs. More than 20 men, angels and fallen saints alike, were taken down. Harder was the key witness. His testimony sent shockwaves through the biker world. But betraying the Angels carried a price. A $2 million bounty was placed on his head. He and his family were placed in witness protection and relocated to safety outside of Canada. Yet officials later ejected him from the program, citing drug use and broken rules. Harder said the truth was more straightforward. He was no longer useful. What followed was a spiral. He was arrested again in Saskatoon with a loaded gun in his car, claiming he needed it for protection. He spent 743 days in solitary confinement awaiting trial, which is the United Nations definition of torture. When finally released, his health was broken. He admitted guilt to weapons charges but remained haunted by the choices he had made. Noel Harder passed away in early 2025 at the age of 43. At his funeral in Saskatoon, there was no police escort, no protection, no honor guard, and later became the central figure in the largest organized crime syndicate crime bust in Saskatchewan's history. To some, he was a master manipulator and a narcissist. To others, he was a man who gave the police the clearest window into the Hells Angels operations they had ever seen. For the Angels, he was worse than any rival patch. He was proof that betrayal from inside could be more dangerous than any outside enemy. And in Germany, the Hells Angels transformed biker culture into a network of organized power. Here, their leaders operate like generals, commanding territory, loyalty, and influence far beyond the road. Hells Angels, the most powerful bosses in Germany. Number 1. Nekati Neko, Arabachi. He is among the most famous Hells Angels presidents currently on social media and known worldwide. He was born on February 14, 1972, in Cologne, Köln, West Germany, to Turkish parents. Nekati's influence started during the 1990s, when he started gaining influence in Cologne's red light scene. Specifically, he worked with bouncers who were under his control and affiliated with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. By 1999, he controlled one of the most powerful pimp networks in Cologne's red light district. His influence stretched beyond Cologne to even Frankfurt, and in the early 2000s, his fingerprints were everywhere. Cologne's underworld became his empire, but violent ambition always carries a cost. In 2002, police finally caught up. He was arrested and charged with a series of crimes that include pimping, human trafficking, assault, extortion, weapons violation, and racketeering. Arabachi confessed to the charges during his trial in 2004, but prison could not stop him from pulling the strings. While in detention, he even planned to kill the prosecutor by hiring an Albanian contract killer. And in 2004, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. However, due to legal hurdles and errors in court documentation, Arabachi was acquitted of additional charges. Finally, he was released in 2007 and deported to Turkey. But he reinvented himself in Monaco again. The street enforcer was now a billionaire biker boss, surrounded by luxury cars, exclusive clubs, and armed bodyguards. From Monaco, his influence stretched across Europe. His network extended from Germany to Turkey, across the Balkans, and deep into North Africa. He brokered deals between mafias, biker gangs, and even state-linked operatives. And finally, in 2010, he was appointed president of the Hells Angels MC Nomads Turkey. In 2015, Spanish authorities issued a European arrest warrant, EAEW, for Arabachi. But his Turkish citizenship complicated the enforcement, and Turkey does not extradite its own citizens. But power at that scale doesn't stay untouchable forever. By 2025, Interpol had him high on their list. And in September, Slovak police, working with German authorities, stormed a luxury restaurant in Slovakia during an undercover operation. Inside, they found Arabachi with his associates. But authorities could not detain him longer, and after a few hours, the biker boss was free again. One thing about Nakati is established that he knows how to maintain the balance of power and avoid controversies while maintaining a strict hold. Number 2. İkinci Aygun Mucuk.
Wie wollen Sie ihn mal sterben?
Weiß ich nicht. Wenn es geht, alt, mit einer schönen jungen Frau.
This is Aygun Mucuk speaking to reporters in 2016, and he mentions that he didn't want to die anytime soon. But what he didn't know was that the countdown had already begun, and he has only 28 days left to live. And on Friday, October 7th, 2016, Aygun Mucuk was found dead by the cleaner for the clubhouse in Wettenberg in Gießen. But how come a Hells Angels president is targeted so easily in his own clubhouse? The story leads back to a long rivalry with fellow Hells Angels brothers, and this was not the first time he was attacked. Just 2 years prior, on July 2nd, 2014, Mucuk had been wounded by gunshots outside a Frankfurt club. But why was Aygun Mucuk fighting his own brothers? And why was he being attacked multiple times? The story leads back to Mucuk's origin. He was born in Germany to Turkish parents and joined the Hells Angels under the leadership of Walter Burkhard, commonly known as Schnitzel Walter. Back then, the club was dominated by old-school traditionalists. But as the years went by, the face of the gang began to change. More Turkish and Kurdish recruits joined, reshaping the balance of power inside the chapter. That shift became Mucuk's opportunity, and he rebelled, undermining his leaders first behind closed doors, and later the rebellion turned open. Rallying the younger migrants who now made up a big chunk of the membership, Mucuk challenged the old guard Schnitzel Walter directly. The violence forced the American Hells Angels leadership to intervene. To stop Germany from tearing itself apart, a deal was struck. In November 2014, he emerged from the hospital as the president of Gießen, transformed into both a symbol and a threat. On the other hand, Schnitzel Walter, despite all his power, could not contain Mucuk, and Mucuk was not only able to dodge expulsion, but also received permission to start his own charter. Mucuk's predominantly Turkish faction was granted its own charter in Gießen. For the first time, a breakaway chapter had officially been recognized, not crushed. By then, Mucuk was considered one of Europe's most important outlaw figures. Mucuk rose to the top, becoming the face of a younger, more diverse wave of bikers inside Germany. But his rebellion came at a price, one that would be paid in blood. The tussle between the two factions continued in September 2016. Outside a former U.S. Army barracks in Wettenberg, the clubhouse of the Gießen chapter, he was found dead. He had been shot multiple times, left lifeless in the very stronghold he had fought to build. Looked like this time, his luck had run out. Authorities did not have any person of interest, but no one was convicted. Law enforcement immediately suspected the Frankfurt West End charter, pointing specifically toward Burkhard's inner circle. For investigators, the motive seemed obvious: the long-running feud between Frankfurt and Gießen. Yet, despite collecting surveillance footage and forensic evidence, police couldn't make arrests. Mucuk's assassination sent shockwaves through Germany's outlaw biker scene. He had been a symbol of change, a man who dared to defy tradition to lead a chapter built on migrant strength. Number 3. Walter Burkhard. Schnitzel Walter. Born in Frankfurt in the 1960s, Burkhard grew up in a divided Germany. Walter Burkhard, also known as Schnitzel Walter, had a very humble beginning. He stared from a butcher's shop in the affluent neighborhoods of Frankfurt. While the nation was undergoing rapid modernization, pockets of society remained deeply traditional. Burkhard trained as a Fleermeister. He ran a successful meat shop known for quality and freshness. But behind the scenes, Walter was drawn to a different kind of brotherhood, and eventually following his, he joined the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club and soon became an integral part of the West End Charter in Frankfurt. The Hells Angels had long established a presence in Germany, but the Frankfurt West End Charter was different: wealthy, urban, and well-connected. His butcher shop remained a front and local landmark. But behind the scenes, the chapter engaged in weapons trafficking, drug distribution, nightclub protection rackets, debt collection through intimidation and territorial enforcement across Frankfurt's red light and entertainment districts. Under his leadership, the West End chapter started operating like an organized crime syndicate. Burkhard knew how to instill fear without ever raising his voice. But in 2012, Burkhard faced resistance from where he expected the least. The blow of hot air came from within the club. Turkish and Kurdish origin members like Aygun Muçuk began forming their own powerful factions within the club. Despite Walter's attempts to maintain control, his chapter was divided. But 4 years late, the rebel president was found dead in his clubhouse. He had been shot multiple times in the head and upper body at close range. Law enforcement responded with a sweeping crackdown. Police raided Hells Angels clubhouses in Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, and other cities. Dozens of members were arrested on unrelated weapons or drug charges, and then Burkhard vanished from public view. Unlike many of his counterparts, Walter Burkhard was never arrested for Muç's murder. Burkhard continued to pull strings behind the scenes, operating through intermediaries and loyal club veterans. In 2024, another shocking incident brought Burkhard's name back into media focus. A brutal Hells Angels brawl at Frankfurt Airport involving members from multiple chapters. Though Burkhard was not present, several West End affiliates were. Burkhard was fined in court and was ordered to pay 10,500 euros in fines. He never gave interviews, he never testified, he never confessed. And in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, that silence is more powerful than 1,000 words. Number 4, Kadir Padir. Padir was a member of the Bandidos in Germany, and he left the club. After defecting from the Bandidos in 2010, Padir joined the Hells Angels and quickly climbed the ranks, becoming president of the Hells Angels Berlin City chapter. The Berlin chapter was notorious for running drug routes, protection rackets, and illegal gambling halls. He had an iron fist control over the club and territory. But in 2014, everything changed. On 10th January 2014, inside a betting office in Berlin-Reinickendorf, a sympathizer of the Bandidos was shot dead inside a betting shop. He was identified as Tahir O, 26. 13 masked men entered the betting shop and fired 8 shots, 6 of which hit Tahir O, and he was killed.
Betreten. Einem Rollkommando gleich stürmen, wie sich später herausstellen wird, Hells Angels das Café. Hier die Originalaufnahmen aus der Überwachungskamera. Innerhalb von nur 5 Sekunden ab. Nach nicht einmal 30 Sekunden haben die Täter den Laden wieder verlassen.
When the authorities investigated, they traced the link to this killing to Kadir Padir. He was accused of being the instigator of that killing. The prosecution alleges he played a leadership role in ordering or organizing the attack. The trial began in 2014 and lasted for several years. In court, Padir faced accusations of running his charter like a mafia syndicate, giving orders that turned disputes into executions. But the real shock came from inside his own circle. Kasra Zargaran, once a trusted associate, turned against them. He turned state witness in the betting office murder trial. Zargaran described in his testimony the details of how Padir's orders flowed from the top down. He painted Padir not just as a biker boss, but as the godfather of Berlin, the man who decided who lived and who didn't. Finally, in 2019, judges at a Berlin court delivered verdicts. Padir was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role as the instigator in that murder. And in 2022, his appeal was also rejected. The German federal court upheld the sentences for several Hells Angels in that case. But Padir's influence didn't die with the verdict. Sentenced to a long prison term, he proved that bars couldn't hold his reach. Investigators say encrypted phones and loyal visitors turned his cell into a command post. Even from prison, debts were collected, rivals were silenced, and orders still carried his name. And that's the paradox. Kadir Padir sits locked in a cell, but Berlin's streets still whisper his name. If a murder trial and a prison sentence couldn't strip him of power, then what can? Number 5, Ramin Yakhtaparast. Ramin's story doesn't follow the usual outlaw biker script. He was an Iranian German and once a rising member of Bandidos, but he switched to other gangs and finally landed in Hells Angels. There, he quickly rose to ranks and became president of Hells Angels' MG City Charter in Mönchengladbach. He was already notorious to the police for his violent past and had also been involved in murdering another biker. But his story took a darker turn when he became an asset to the Iranian government, specifically Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Iran benefited from his fugitive status, and his outlaw connections made him valuable. He became a bridge between the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and criminal networks in Europe. One of his assignments included an arson attack on a Jewish synagogue in Germany. And when the authorities traced back the link to him, he fled to Iran and mocked German police on Instagram. Germany does not have an extradition treaty with Iran, so he was living a free life out there until the haven could not protect him anymore. But on May 9th, 2023, Yektaparast was shot dead in Tehran, the place he considered a safe house, allegedly in an operation carried out by Mossad. While IRGC continued to deny his affiliation with the force, his obituary referred to his death as martyrdom, and he was buried in Section 19 of Behesht Zahra Cemetery, reserved for Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps members. And now, one question lingers. If a single outlaw boss could be turned into an international agent, how many more shadows like Ramin Yektaparast might already be at work? Number 6. Frank Hanebuth. Frank Hanebuth was born and raised in Hanover, Germany. At that time, the biker scene was already violent. But Hanebuth stood apart because he wasn't satisfied with just being another rider. He wanted absolute control. He had already managed to climb to the top of the Hells Angels chapter in Hanover. Under his rule, rival clubs quickly learned that crossing him came with serious consequences. But Hanebuth's ambitions didn't stop at Hanover. In 2009, he turned his attention to Mallorca, Spain. For most, it was a tourist paradise. For Hanebuth, it was the perfect stage to expand his empire. There, he built a Spanish chapter of the Hells Angels right in the heart of the island's nightlife, transforming the beaches and bars into a stronghold for his power. Strip clubs, bars, and large parts of the nightlife economy fell under his crew's control through violence and intimidation. Money flowed in through luxury cars, high-end real estate, and businesses that looked legitimate from the outside. But soon, the investigators found their criminal empire disguised as success. On 23rd of July 2013, Frank Hanebuth was arrested in Mallorca by the Spanish. 200 officers raided 25 properties across Mallorca, seizing cash, luxury vehicles, weapons, and computers. After his arrest, he was sent to solitary confinement and remained in pre-trial detention until July 2015 and was released on bail of 60,000 euros with conditions to report regularly to the police. But years later, in January 2023, a major trial began in Madrid. Hanebuth once again faced charges of membership in a criminal organization, money laundering, and illegal possession of firearms. Prosecutors requested a prison term of up to 13 years and fines of 4 to 4.5 million euros. But on 26 September 2023, Spain's High Court in Madrid acquitted Hanebuth and his co-defendants of the main charge of belonging to a criminal organization, ruling that it could not be proven. Number 7. Mario Amtman. He was known as the man for the rough stuff, but his journey with the biker world did not start with Hells Angels. He began with a relatively less famous bike club named Bloody Devils, a one-of-only kind of gang at that time with the motto of strike first, ask questions later. In 1971, Mario Amtman thought of something that would transform him from being a local boss to an internationally recognized figure. He sent his associate to the USA and asked the original Hells Angels for permission to open a chapter in Germany. Thus, they founded the first German charter of the Hells Angels, and soon they became one of the most powerful gangs in Hamburg, Germany. But to fuel their power, they started extortion. They would go into bars, vandalize the furniture, urinate on the bar, and indiscriminately beat patrons. As this was not enough, they opened one of their own clubs, Angel's Place. And to wipe out the competition, they started terrorizing the local landlords, collecting protection money. Anyone who didn't pay the stay fee received visits. the bikers repeatedly crashed their motorcycles into the bars. So, the authorities caught up to them. And in 1983, the police took action. 500 officers carried out a raid. The Hells Angels and their symbols got banned in Hamburg. This was a major setback for the Hells Angels, but they regained power soon after the trial ended in the club's favor. Some of the members were sentenced to prison, and after serving a few years in prison, they were back on the streets. And soon they were back to extortion, drug trafficking, prostitution, arms smuggling, and this time they expanded their operations. Mario Amtmann, 2017, one day after his 69th birthday, Hamburg hosted his funeral. Over 200 bikers from across Germany and Europe rode in to pay their respects. The funeral unfolded under heavy surveillance, with plainclothes officers and covert intelligence units watching closely, fearing rival attacks or power struggles. Number 8. Darius F. In Hamburg's biker world, few names carried as much weight as Darius F. He was sergeant-at-arms at Hells Angels, a third highest rank in hierarchy. Darius was not only responsible for maintaining order and discipline within the club, but also was at the forefront of the drive to push the rival gangs, especially Bandidos and Mongols, out of the city. Because whoever controlled Hamburg's underworld also controlled its nightclubs, protection rackets, and drug routes. And for years, Darius made sure that control belonged to him. His dominance seemed untouchable. Until one night on August 26, 2018, Darius was driving his white Bentley, leaving his favorite pizzeria, Palermo, in Hamburg. Everything seemed perfect until a Mercedes next to him lowered its window. A gun appeared and shot 5 bullets to his head and upper body. Darius was attacked. It was an assassination attempt. But against all odds, Darius survived. Still, the attack left permanent scars on his body. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Once feared enforcer was now confined to a wheelchair. When the authorities investigated the attack, it was traced back to old rivals. The plot was commissioned by ex-members of the Mongols and led by an individual named Arash R. and his girlfriend, who wanted revenge for a failed hit against them 2 years earlier, an attack they believed had been ordered by the Hells Angels themselves. And finally, Arash R. was sentenced to life. His girlfriend received more than 12 years behind bars. But then the case took a shocking turn. The girlfriend confessed in court that she alone had planned the shooting. With that single admission, the case flipped, opening the door for Arash R. to escape his life sentence. The attack on Darius F. was proof of a brutal truth that in the outlaw biker world, sometimes the deadliest threats come from men who once sat across the same table. And by surviving, Darius's name moved from feared enforcer to living legend, a man who took 5 bullets in broad daylight and still lived to tell the tale. Number 9. Frank Weber, the architect of Berlin's Hells Angels. Frank Weber was one of the most respected Hells Angels in Europe. Before his name became synonymous with Berlin's biker culture, Weber made his mark as a skilled tattoo artist. He opened the Kreuzstich Tattoo Studio on Adalbertstrasse and went on to found Europe's oldest tattoo convention. His Berlin Tattoo Convention drew bikers and enthusiasts from across Europe and even America, turning Kreuzberg into a meeting point of biker tradition and ink culture. Weber's journey into the biker world began in 1977 when he started his first motorcycle club. Just a few years later, in 1981, he opened his first shop selling Harley-Davidson equipment. By 1990, he had co-founded the Berlin branch of the Hells Angels, cementing his place in biker history. Unlike the newer generation of angels who leaned toward drug trafficking and protection rackets, Weber was a traditionalist. For him, the club's core identity was about motorcycles, tattoos, brotherhood, and nights spent drinking beer, not business empires built on crime. This old-school stance earned him respect far beyond Berlin. When Weber passed away at the age of 66 after a long illness, it felt like the end of an era. His funeral in Berlin on November 2nd, 2024, became a spectacle of loyalty and power. More than 1,000 mourners filled the streets, including Hells Angels from the US, Canada, Turkey and across Europe. A roaring procession of motorcycles thundered through the city, leading to his burial at Grossgerchenstrasse Cemetery in Schöneberg, where other Hells Angels also rest. For many, Weber's death wasn't just the loss of a man. It was the closing chapter of Berlin's traditional biker spirit. Legends die, leaders fall, but the Hells Angels in Germany remain. And when one boss is gone, another is always waiting in the shadows. But when biker brotherhood met racial supremacy, it marked the darkest turn in outlaw history. The line between a club and a cult blurred, leaving behind a legacy that is condemned to this day. This was the rise and the downfall of the Ku Klux Klan bikers. But not everyone who joined the Ku Klux Klan stayed with it forever, especially not Dennis Michael McGiffin. He thought the club was not radical enough. He joined the Klan in the early 2000s and rose through the ranks, becoming a Grand Dragon, a senior official within the Ku Klux Klan. He wanted to create something that fulfills his desires of extreme radicalism. At first, Dennis believed in what the group stood for, but over time, he grew frustrated. In his eyes, they weren't doing enough. So he did what a rebel would do. He left. McGiffin walked away from the Ku Klux Klan disappointed. He believed they talked big but didn't do enough. McGiffin's hopes were high, so instead of giving up, he built something new. In 1998, alongside a group of former Klan members and white supremacists, he formed a group and gave it a name pulled straight from a violent neo-Nazi novel, The New Order, a tribute to Bob Matthews and the terror group described in the Turner Diaries. They weren't interested in rallies or speeches. They wanted action. Dennis McGiffin had been part of hate groups for a long time. He had ties to the Ku Klux Klan in Illinois and a group called Aryan Nations. By the mid-1990s, he started looking for people who felt the same way he did. He found men who were tired of waiting and wanted to do something. One of them was Wallace Scott Wykerding, a former prison guard who got fired for giving KKK flyers to inmates. Others included Daniel Rick, Ralph P. Bach, Glenn Lavelle Loutharp, and Carl C. Shave. Most of them didn't have violent records, but they all believed in white supremacist ideas, and they believed the time for action had come. By 1997, the group was deep into plotting violence. They talked about turning legal weapons into machine guns, robbing banks, and launching coordinated attacks. Their targets: civil rights groups, Jewish organizations, even city water supplies, all part of a larger plan to spread fear, spark chaos, and fund their movement. Some plots were so extreme they didn't even seem real, but the weapons, maps, and materials they gathered told a different story. But in early 1998, everything fell apart. The FBI raided the group's hideout and found guns, bombs, poison, and maps. Proof they weren't just talking. They were ready to strike. It all started when a former member turned informant provided the FBI with recordings that exposed the full extent of their plans. That's when the world first heard the name Dennis McGiffin. He was arrested, charged with federal weapons violations, and later sentenced to 7 years in prison. The defense argued it was all just talk, but the evidence said otherwise. He finished his sentence in 2004, but he wasn't done. Behind bars, Dennis McGiffin had studied the culture of motorcycle clubs, the power, the loyalty, the image. People respected them. So when he got out in 2010, he didn't return to white robes and backroom meetings. He put on a vest and started something new. McGiffin founded a motorcycle club and named it Sadistic Souls Motorcycle Club, a white supremacist gang disguised as a biker brotherhood. Their colors were black and silver. Their motto was the Black and Silver Solution. Soon, that phrase showed up everywhere, on hate websites, in prisons, and at secret gatherings. On their website, they said forced integration was genocide. They claimed the white race was being erased. By 2010, Dennis McGiffin had rebuilt himself. He had established the Sadistic Souls MC, and it had members across various states. The Sadistic Souls were growing. They had members across several states, But McGiffin didn't just want attention, he wanted fear. He needed something stronger, something with roots in the white supremacist world. That's when he looked to Aryan Nations. Aryan Nations started in the 1970s. It was founded by Richard Butler, a former aerospace engineer who preached that white Christians were the only true Americans. According to him, everyone else, Jews, black people, and immigrants, didn't belong. Under Butler, Aryan Nations became a gathering point for hate. Neo-Nazis, skinheads, and former Klan members trained on their land in northern Idaho. The group ran armed patrols, held military drills, and hosted yearly events where hate groups from across the country came together. Butler preached about a coming race war and used his group to spread fear and violence. They handed out propaganda, plotted attacks, and built alliances with other white supremacist movements. For a time, Aryan Nations was one of the most powerful and feared hate groups in America. They had a compound in northern Idaho where members trained with guns, marched in uniform, and held rallies filled with Nazi flags and fiery sermons. It looked like a church, but it functioned more like a paramilitary camp. But power fades, and so did they. As the years passed, cracks started to show. Members turned violent, even against police. The group drew national headlines for hate crimes. Eventually, their compound was raided. A major lawsuit by the Southern Poverty Law Center nearly bankrupted them. The fall was steep. Their founder, Richard Butler, died in 2004. With him, most of Aryan Nations' influence disappeared. But the ideas didn't die. They just moved into new names, new leaders, and new strategies. After Butler's death, the movement splintered. There was no clear successor, so different groups stepped up and claimed they were the true Aryan Nations. One of those factions rose in Louisiana, led by Maurice Goulet. Goulet wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a soldier. He was a career criminal, with a long record and deep roots in the white power movement. His rap sheet said it all: shoplifting, drug possession, aggravated assault. He was even involved in a bank robbery plot. In 1997, he rammed a police car in Ohio, leading to another arrest and another prison stint. But in extremist circles, that kind of record only added to his reputation. By the time he was released from federal prison in August 2010, Goulet was ready to reclaim power. He quickly declared his faction the true Aryan Nations and began rebuilding. He launched weekly sermons online called Sword of the Truth, preaching a violently racist version of Christian identity theology. He also adopted the title Senior Pastor of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, reviving the religious front that Richard Butler had once used to give Aryan Nations legitimacy. Goulet's claims were big. He called his group the most feared and revered white supremacist organization the world has ever known, and the fastest growing pro-white Christian organization in the world. But the truth? His chapter was small with few aging members. There was no real momentum. Still, Goulet wore Richard Butler's legacy like a badge. His faction may have been fading, but Goulet still had something valuable: the Aryan Nations name. And that's exactly when Dennis McGiffin came into the picture. Goulet saw an opportunity to revive his version of the Aryan Nations by teaming up with McGiffin. And McGiffin, he saw something too: the missing racial spark. He needed to take his biker club even further. Therefore, the two merged under a new banner: the Sadistic Souls Aryan Nations Motorcycle Club. It still looked like an MC on the outside, with black and silver vests, patches, and bikes. But the message had shifted. They called themselves Christian bikers, but their version of Christianity was rooted in racism and violence. They preached separation, warned of war, and blamed others for the problems they created. Each man got what he needed. McGiffin gained a legacy. Goulet gained life. Together, they transformed a fading hate group and a rising outlaw club into a thriving institute. Initially, the alliance appeared unstoppable. The newly merged Sadistic Souls Aryan Nations MC began spreading fast. Chapters popped up across the Midwest and the South. Members from other white supremacist groups started paying attention. On the surface, it looked like the far right had found its next rising powerhouse, a perfect blend of old-school hate and modern outlaw energy. But behind closed doors, the cracks were already showing. 2 leaders, 2 egos, 1 throne. Dennis McGiffin and Morris Gullett were never built to share power. McGiffin came from the biker world, harsh, aggressive, and fueled by image. He wore leather, flashed middle fingers, and built his club like a street gang with patches. Gullett, on the other hand, came from the old guard of Aryan nations. He believed in structure, Christian identity theology, and white nationalist order. In his eyes, the sadistic souls were reckless, more interested in being seen than in building a true racial movement. It didn't take long for things to explode. Gullett began accusing McGiffin's members of race mixing. He claimed some were involved in relationships with non-white partners. For a movement obsessed with racial purity, that was the ultimate betrayal. He didn't keep it private either. Gullett aired the accusations online and in private emails. He said the sadistic souls were drunks and degenerates, calling them more of a photo club than a brotherhood. The final blow came when he said they had no place under the Aryan Nation's banner. McGiffin fired back hard. He went public with his own attack, calling Gullett a welfare king and a costume Nazi. He photoshopped Gullett into an obscene meme, mocking him for being out of shape, out of touch, and irrelevant. According to him, Gullett was more interested in online sermons than real action. It was public humiliation. Soon, members had to pick sides. Some chapters stayed loyal to McGiffin. Others quietly dropped out or disappeared. A few sided with Gullett, but his faction had little ground left to hold. The merger that once promised strength collapsed under the weight of pride, infighting, and 2 men who couldn't stop trying to outlead each other. In the end, it was 2 egos and no survivors. But McGiffin was unstoppable. By 2015, he was already thinking beyond the sadistic souls Aryan Nation's MC. He was planning something bigger, a new alliance to unite some of the extreme hate groups in the country. It would bring together the sadistic souls, the United Clans of America, and the creativity movement under one banner, the Black and Silver Solution. McGiffin's goal was to create something too big to ignore. But before the merger could take full shape, Dennis Michael McGiffin was caught in a personal scandal that shook the core of the movement he was trying to lead. Just before a planned Black and Silver Solution conference in Scottsboro, Alabama, allegations of race mixing resurfaced. This time, the spotlight was on McGiffin, facing allegations that he had fathered a child with a non-white partner. In white supremacist circles, this was seen as a betrayal of racial purity and would have been considered outright treason under the original Aryan Nation's leadership. The Black and Silver Solution was supposed to be a powerful alliance. McGiffin even promoted it as the true successor to Richard Butler's Aryan Nations. But the scandal only made things worse. Doubts grew about McGiffin's leadership, and the movement he spent years building began to fall apart. McGiffin's reputation was ruined overnight. The man who once preached loyalty and racial purity was now being laughed at and pushed away by the same people who used to follow him. And while everything was falling apart, his own half-brother came forward and spoke out. Jeff Hurst, McGiffin's half-brother, had stayed quiet for years, but now he spoke up, and he didn't hold back anything. He talks about purity, about pride, but he won't even claim his own kid. That baby didn't ask to be born mixed. Dennis made that choice, and now he hides behind leather and hate while his child grows up without a father. That's not strength, that's cowardice. This spread quickly through biker forums and underground radio shows. McGiffin stayed silent. And just like that, the loudest voice of the sadistic souls, the man who once dreamed of leading a new white empire, became the symbol of its biggest hypocrisy. After the scandal broke, the Black and Silver Solution didn't just fall apart. It tore itself apart from the inside. What started as hushed conversations in biker bars and online forums quickly turned into full-blown outrage. The whispers weren't just about McGiffin's actions anymore, they were about his entire legacy. His followers, many of whom had once treated his words like gospel, now questioned everything. How could the man who preached racial purity be tied to the very thing he condemned? In a movement obsessed with bloodlines, the news hit like a wrecking ball. For years, McGiffin had stood as a figure of authority, someone who demanded loyalty, discipline, and strict racial boundaries. But now, that image was cracked beyond repair. His own bloodline had become the movement's greatest embarrassment. McGiffin tried to spin the narrative. He downplayed the incident. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, a mistake from the past. But no excuse was enough. The contradiction was too obvious, the hypocrisy too large. And then the real collapse began. The people closest to McGiffin, the men who had worn the patch, defended the club, and bled for its cause, began walking away. They didn't just disagree, they felt betrayed. One of them was longtime member Dave Biquette. He didn't just leave the club, he lit a match on his way out. In an online post that quickly went viral within white nationalist circles, Biquette wrote, "You've lied to your club brothers about having anything to do with your son who has a racial slur child. You said it was a one-night stand, but it was a year-long relationship. He has a custody agreement, pays child support, and still sees this child. Do you remember Christmas at the clubhouse, Dennis? The year your grandchild came to see Santa?" McGiffin didn't deny it. Instead, he revoked Biquette's membership and issued a statement. "It was an Indian, which is no better to me. He was 15. At 16, it was over. He pays child support because the courts make him. I ain't never with that kid." The message was blunt, angry, and only added fuel to the fire. To many within the movement, it wasn't a defense. It was an admission. But things didn't stop there. McGiffin's own half-brother, Jeff Hurst, stepped into the spotlight. For years, Hurst had remained mostly in the background, quiet, observing. But now he jumped straight into the firestorm, posting online. "The truth hurts, don't it, Denny? You can tell anybody the lies, but I'm your brother. I know the real truth, don't I? And you don't want everybody else finding out what's really going on." By now, the scandal wasn't just about one child. It had grown into something bigger. It was about a leader who had broken the very code he expected everyone else to live by. The man who once stood for purity, loyalty, and hard-line beliefs now appeared to be a hypocrite to the movement he claimed to lead. And the damage didn't stop at family drama or online feuds. At the same time, McGiffin made another bold and highly controversial decision. He shifted the club's stance on religion. Traditionally, groups like Aryan nations followed Christian identity, a fringe, deeply racist theology that claimed white people were God's chosen race. It wasn't just belief, it was doctrine. Non-Christians, in their view, didn't belong. It was a foundational pillar of their ideology. But McGiffin was changing that. In an attempt to widen the reach of the sadistic souls, he opened the doors to white supremacists from other religious backgrounds, even those who didn't follow Christianity at all. Odinists, creators, National Socialists, pagan white nationalists. All were now welcome, so long as they upheld the core racial ideals. On the club's website, the new policy was laid out clearly. Religion cannot control the destiny of our folk. To be part of Aryan Nation's SSMC, you may be identity, Christian separatist, creator, Odinist, or plain NS National Socialist. We will not turn good brothers down due to theological issues. To McGiffin, this was a step toward unity, but to others, it was betrayal. The creativity movement pulled out. The United Clans of America cut ties. Even inside the sadistic souls, chapters began dropping his name from websites or quietly shutting down. The Black and Silver Solution, a dream of uniting hate groups under one flag, was dead. Once again, the sadistic souls MC stood alone. No more coalitions, no more Aryan nations, no more Black and Silver Solution. Just Dennis McGiffin, and whoever was still willing to ride beside him. Over the next 6 years, the club went through a whirlwind of change. Chapters opened and vanished. Core members walked away. At one point, the club nearly dissolved altogether during a quiet but heavy mass exodus. It could have been the end, but McGiffin didn't fold. Instead, he circled the wagons. He shrank the inner circle, rewrote the rules, and refocused his vision. The club stayed whites only. That never changed. But when it came to religion, he shifted gears. Strict Christian identity was out. Flexibility was in. Now, sadistic souls would welcome any white nationalist, regardless of faith, as long as they supported the cause. To critics, it looked like desperation. To loyalists, it meant McGiffin still had gas left in the tank. He didn't rebuild an empire, but he didn't vanish either. Today, according to the group's website, Sadistic Souls MC remains active and recruiting. They claim chapters not just across the US, but also in Australia, England, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Germany, Ireland, and Canada. They still promote white nationalist ideology, using the imagery and structure of outlaw biker culture as their shield. And Dennis Michael McGiffin, he's still wearing the patch. Across decades and continents, these names have defined what it means to rule the road through power, loyalty, and fear. And as new generations rise, one truth remains: the world still remembers the most feared bikers who ever lived.